I am Stephen. I am 70 years old. I am a retired master builder who spent decades breaking my back to give my daughter the world. Last Father's Day, she invited me to a lavish barbecue at her new mansion. While she handed her wealthy father-in-law a Mediterranean cruise ticket worth $20,000, she slid a crumpled $5 lottery ticket across the table to me. I simply smiled, put the ticket in my pocket, and went home. That night, I scratched it. I won $190 million, and before I claimed a single dime, I built a trap that would strip her of everything she valued. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The smell of expensive cigars and roasted Wagyu beef hung thick in the air of Natalie's sprawling backyard. I sat isolated on a rigid metal patio chair in the far corner, adjusting the collar of my faded brown suit. A string quartet played soft classical music near the edge of a massive infinity pool. Around me, dozens of guests dressed in designer clothes laughed and mingled. I held a cheap plastic cup of tap water, watching my own daughter ignore my existence. I spent 20 years working double shifts. I poured concrete in the freezing rain and framed houses under the blistering sun, just to pay for Natalie's elite private schooling after her mother passed away. I sacrificed my own needs and my own retirement so she would never feel less than her wealthy classmates. Now surrounded by her country club friends, I was the embarrassing secret she had to tolerate. She had told her husband's family I was a reckless gambler who wasted my life. I knew this because I overheard her whispering it to a neighbor last Thanksgiving. I stayed silent, then hoping my quiet devotion would eventually break through her arrogance. I was wrong. The music suddenly stopped. Natalie tapped a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute, commanding the attention of the crowd. She stood at the center of the patio, wearing a silk dress that cost more than my monthly rent. Her husband Brian stood beside her with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Next to them was Leonard. Leonard was Brian's father. He was a retired investment banker who wore custom suits and looked at me as if I were a stain on the patio stones. Natalie raised her glass. She spoke about the importance of family, about honoring the men who guide us. She turned to Leonard and handed him a pristine, glossy white envelope. Leonard opened it with a theatrical flourish. He pulled out a gold-embossed voucher. Natalie announced loudly that it was an all-inclusive Mediterranean cruise package. She proudly stated it cost $20,000. The crowd erupted into applause. Leonard kissed her cheek and thanked her for being the perfect daughter-in-law. Then Natalie turned toward me. The applause died down. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the patio. She walked over to my corner. She did not hand me a glossy envelope. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled, neon-colored piece of cardboard. She slid a $5 scratch-off lottery ticket across the glass table. Her voice cut through the quiet air, sharp and deliberately loud, so every guest could hear. She said, "I get seasick anyway, so a cruise would be a waste of money." She told me to try my luck, because it is the thought that counts. The humiliation was physically heavy. I looked at the cheap piece of cardboard resting on the expensive glass table. I looked up at my daughter. Her eyes held no warmth, only a cold, calculated challenge. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to yell or complain so she could prove to her wealthy friends that I was the bitter, ungrateful burden she claimed I was. Leonard smirked around his cigar. Brian looked away in feigned embarrassment, hiding a smile behind his hand. I did not flip the table. I did not raise my voice. Decades of working on high-rise scaffolding taught me how to keep my balance when the wind tries to push you off. I simply picked up the ticket. I folded it neatly. I placed it into my breast pocket. I stood up, looked her directly in the eyes, offered a quiet thank you, and walked straight out the front door. The bus ride back to my cramped, poorly lit apartment took an hour. The contrast between her marble floors and my peeling linoleum was a bitter pill to swallow. I unlocked my door and stepped into the small living room. The air smelled of old paper and damp wood. I did not turn on the television. I did not turn on the main lights. I sat at my scratched kitchen table. I took the crumpled ticket from my pocket and smoothed it out on the table. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a dull quarter. I began to scratch the silver coating off the cheap cardboard. I did it methodically, treating it like a task that just needed to be finished. The first number appeared. It matched the winning row. The second number aligned perfectly. I kept scratching. My breathing slowed. The third, fourth, and fifth numbers revealed themselves in a flawless, identical sequence. I stopped. I stared at the final square. I pressed the edge of the coin against the cardboard and cleared the last patch of silver. 6 numbers in a perfect row. The prize amount printed below the matching row made my heart stop beating for a full second. $190 million. I did not trust my own eyes. I pulled out my phone and opened the state lottery application. I aligned the camera with the barcode on the bottom of the ticket. The screen processed the image. A bright green banner flashed across my phone screen confirming the exact amount. $190 million. I did not cheer. I did not jump up and down or cry tears of joy. A cold, absolute clarity settled over my mind. I knew exactly what my daughter would do if she found out. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized 30 years ago. I called Oliver. Oliver was a ruthless corporate lawyer, a man who devoured hostile takeovers for breakfast and crushed opposing counsel without breaking a sweat. He was also my oldest and most loyal friend. When Oliver is a struggling, penniless law student, fighting to keep his lights on, I built his very first office desk for free. I worked nights and weekends using leftover lumber to frame his office walls so he could start his practice. We forged a blood brotherhood in those early days of dirt and sawdust. He never forgot that debt. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and professional even at this late hour. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed to see him immediately. I told him I held a piece of cardboard worth $190 million. I explained that my own daughter was positioned to legally hijack every single cent the moment it registered in the banking system. I told him I needed to hide a massive fortune, and I needed to build a fortress around it tonight, before the vultures smelled the blood. Oliver did not hesitate. The tone of his voice shifted from a corporate attorney to a soldier preparing for battle. He told me to lock my deadbolt, draw my blinds, and wait for his arrival. He promised we would construct a legal labyrinth so deep my daughter would never find the center. I hung up the phone. I looked at the crumpled ticket resting on the worn table. My daughter thought she had handed me an insult. She had actually handed me the power to destroy her entire fabricated world. The quiet years of suffering were over. The war had just begun. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat at my scratched kitchen table with the neon cardboard pressed flat under my calloused hand. $190 million. Most men would be planning their early morning trip to the lottery headquarters. I was planning a tactical defense. Claiming the money through standard channels was an absolute death sentence for my newfound wealth. 5 years ago, after my wife passed away from pancreatic cancer, the grief temporarily blinded me. My hands shook, my vision blurred, and I fell behind on my utility bills. Natalie swooped in. She played the role of the deeply concerned daughter perfectly. She sat me down at this very kitchen table and placed a joint banking mandate in front of me. She told me it was just to help me manage my checks while I grieved. I was exhausted and heartbroken. I signed the paperwork. From that day on, her name was legally tethered to my primary checking account. I learned the hard way what that meant. Over the years, I noticed small amounts of my pension disappearing. $100 here, $200 there. When I confronted her, she claimed she used it to pay for my medical prescriptions. But I knew the truth. I knew she was using my meager retirement to cover her luxury country club fees. If the state lottery commission wired even a fraction of those massive winnings to my bank, her phone would immediately buzz with a deposit alert. She would transfer the funds to a private offshore account, before I even poured my morning coffee. I needed a ghost ship. I needed a way to transport a massive fortune without making a single ripple in the water. At 3 in the morning, I put on my heavy work coat and walked 4 blocks in the freezing rain. I headed to a 24-hour diner downtown. It was a miserable place with flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of stale grease. It was exactly the kind of place where men with expensive briefcases did not belong. That made it the perfect place to meet Oliver. Oliver walked through the diner doors 10 minutes later. He wore a sharp charcoal trench coat over a tailored suit. He did not look at the worn-out booths or the tired waitress sleeping behind the counter. He walked straight to my table, sat down, and placed a thick leather briefcase between us. Oliver was a man who spoke in contracts and executed hostile corporate takeovers. He looked at my faded brown suit and asked to see the ticket. I slid the piece of cardboard across the sticky laminate table. Oliver put on his reading glasses. He studied the numbers. He studied the barcode. He pulled out his phone and checked the official state lottery registry. For the first time in 30 years of knowing him, I saw Oliver lose his composure. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked at me. He told me I was holding a nuclear bomb. I told him I needed to detonate it without my daughter feeling the blast. I explained the joint account mandate. I explained Natalie's legal access to my finances and her history of siphoning my pension. Oliver did not panic. His mind worked like a steel trap. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of blank legal forms. He told me we were bypassing the traditional banking system entirely. We were not going to claim the ticket in my name. We were going to build an impenetrable fortress. Oliver outlined the strategy with ruthless precision. We were going to establish a highly encrypted blind trust. A blind trust is a financial vehicle where the beneficiary has absolutely no direct control over the assets, and more importantly, their identity is entirely shielded from public record. Oliver would act as the sole legal trustee. He explained that he would set up 3 layers of corporate shell companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming states with the strictest corporate secrecy laws in the country. The Lottery Commission would write the check directly to the trust, not to Stephen, the retired builder. My name would vanish from the transaction completely. For the next 3 hours under the harsh lights of that empty diner, I signed my name dozens of times. I signed articles of incorporation. I signed heavy non-disclosure agreements. I signed the official transfer of ticket ownership over to the newly established foundation. Oliver worked with terrifying efficiency. He texted his junior partners in the middle of the night, ordering them to file the digital paperwork before the sun came up. He instructed them to open a secure private wealth account, completely disconnected from my social security number. By the time the waitress brought us our 3rd cup of bitter black coffee, the trap was fully constructed. Legally, I was still a penniless old man living in a crumbling apartment. Financially, I was a ghost controlling a massive empire. Oliver packed the signed documents and the lottery tickets securely into his briefcase. He locked the combination with a loud, satisfying click. He looked at me with a deadly serious expression. He told me the money was completely safe from my daughter. But then his voice dropped. He warned me that the real danger was about to begin. The State Lottery Commission was required by law to announce exactly where the winning ticket was sold. Before I could ask him what he meant, the small television mounted above the diner counter blared with the morning news. The local anchor appeared on the screen, looking visibly excited. The breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom in bright red letters. The anchor announced that the winning ticket for the $190 million jackpot had been verified. The broadcast cut to a live video feed of a suburban gas station. The anchor proudly revealed the exact location where the winning ticket was purchased. I stared at the television screen. My blood turned to solid ice. I recognized the green and yellow awning immediately. I recognized the cracked pavement near the fuel pumps. It was the exact gas station my son-in-law Brian owned. It was the station where he had bought that $5 joke of a gift just hours before the barbecue. Oliver looked at the television, then looked back at me. The terrible realization hung heavily in the dead air of the diner. Natalie and Brian were going to wake up and see that morning news broadcast. They would know exactly what ticket was sold at that specific register. They would know exactly who they gave it. They were going to realize that the $5 piece of trash they handed me to humiliate me in front of their wealthy friends was actually the key to an unimaginable fortune. And they were going to come hunting for me. I sat in the dark living room of my apartment. It was 2 a.m. The rain had stopped earlier in the evening, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the city. I was waiting. I knew my daughter and her husband would not wait for the sun to come up. The sound of screeching tires suddenly shattered the quiet street outside my window. A heavy luxury SUV jumped the curb and slammed into park directly in front of my building. Car doors slammed shut with violent, reckless force. Heavy footsteps pounded up the exterior wooden stairs of my complex. They did not bother knocking politely. Fists hammered against my thin front door, rattling the cheap brass hinges so hard I thought the wood would splinter. My daughter Natalie began shouting my name through the door. Her voice was pitched an octave higher than normal. It was dripping with fabricated panic and exaggerated affection. She cried out for me to open the door, claiming it was an absolute emergency and that she was terrified. I stood up slowly. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump forward. I practiced my breathing, forcing my chest to heave as if I were a frail, confused old man waking up from a deep sleep. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Natalie practically tackled me. She threw her arms around my neck, sobbing crocodile tears into my worn collar. Brian pushed his way into my apartment right behind her. He scanned the small, empty living room with wild, predatory eyes, checking the corners to see if anyone else was there. Natalie grabbed my hands. She squeezed them tightly and put on the performance of a lifetime. She told me the local news had just broadcasted the exact location where the winning lottery ticket was sold. She gasped for air, claiming my life was in immediate danger. She insisted that violent criminals and desperate people would be hunting for the winner by morning. She said she could not bear the thought of her beloved father being attacked in a bad neighborhood. She told me I had to pack my things right now. She insisted I needed to move into their mansion immediately so they could protect me behind their gated security. The absolute audacity of her lies almost made me smile. She did not care about my safety. She cared about the piece of cardboard she thought was sitting in my pocket. I looked at Brian. His face was tense with poorly concealed greed. He told me to hurry, stating that every second we wasted put the ticket and my life at risk. I played my part flawlessly. I let my hands tremble. I looked around the room with wide, frightened eyes. I stammered, asking them what we were going to do and how we would keep the money safe. Natalie told me not to worry about a single thing. She promised they would handle all the complicated banking and legal work for me. I walked into my cramped bedroom and packed a single canvas duffel bag. I threw in a few worn shirts and a pair of sturdy work boots. I took a deep breath, preparing to hand over the most valuable piece of bait in human history. I walked back into the living room, clutching the bag. I looked at Brian. I reached a shaking hand into my jacket pocket. I pulled out the neon-colored lottery ticket. I held it out toward him with a trembling grip. I told him I was terrified of losing it or getting robbed. I asked him if he would keep it safe for me until the banks opened. Brian snatched the ticket from my fingers with terrifying speed. He did not even try to hide his desperation. His eyes locked onto the 6 matching numbers. A wide, triumphant smile spread across his face. He looked at Natalie and nodded silently, confirming they had the prize. He pulled a sleek leather briefcase from under his arm. He opened the brass clasps, placed the ticket inside a zippered compartment, and locked it securely. He patted my shoulder with a heavy hand and told me I was making the smartest decision of my life. He promised the ticket would be absolutely secure with him. They escorted me down the wooden stairs and rushed me into the back seat of their SUV. The ride to their suburban estate was completely silent. Neither of them spoke a word to me. They did not ask how I was feeling. They did not ask about the incredible stroke of luck or what I wanted to do with the money. They just stared straight ahead at the dark road, communicating only through greedy, knowing glances in the rearview mirror. What they did not know was that the ticket Brian had locked inside his expensive leather briefcase was completely worthless. Oliver is not just a brilliant lawyer. He is a man with extensive, resourceful connections. Hours earlier, before the sun even set, he had sent a trusted associate to procure a high-resolution, flawless color replica of the winning ticket. We used premium cardstock and matched the exact weight and texture of the state lottery paper. To the naked eye, it was a $190 million masterpiece. To a barcode scanner at the Lottery Commission, it was just a piece of printed garbage. The real ticket was already resting inside a biometric safe in Oliver's downtown firm, securely registered to my anonymous trust. The iron gates of their sprawling estate swung open. Brian drove the SUV up the long, winding driveway lined with manicured oak trees and perfectly placed landscape lighting. We parked in front of the massive brick mansion. The sheer size of the house was a monument to the money my daughter had siphoned from my pension and the debt Brian had accumulated, trying to look like a king. We stepped inside the grand foyer. The crystal chandelier cast a bright, cold light over the marble floors. The moment the heavy wooden front door clicked shut behind us, the entire atmosphere changed. The grand illusion dissolved instantly. Natalie let go of my arm. The fake, loving daughter vanished completely. She turned her back on me and walked toward the kitchen. She did not offer me a glass of water. She did not offer me a seat after pulling me out of my bed in the middle of the night. She looked over her shoulder with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She pointed toward a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway. She told me I would not be sleeping in the guest rooms upstairs. She said she had expensive silk sheets, and she did not want the smell of my old apartment ruining her custom furniture. She ordered me to go down to the basement. She said she had thrown an old mattress on the concrete floor for me earlier that day. She told me to stay down there and keep quiet because she was hosting a very important party later that week and did not want me wandering around embarrassing her in front of her friends. Brian did not say a word to defend me. He was already walking up the grand staircase, clutching his briefcase against his chest like a newborn child. I did not argue. I did not show anger. I simply nodded, picked up my duffel bag, and walked to the metal door. I opened it and descended the steep, creaking wooden steps into the freezing, damp darkness of the unfinished cellar. The air smelled of mold and stagnant water. Before I even reached the bottom step, I heard the heavy metal door slam shut above me. A second later, the loud, heavy clank of an exterior deadbolt echoed through the dark stairwell. My own daughter had locked me inside a concrete cage. She thought she had captured a helpless old man and stolen a massive fortune. She felt entirely victorious. She had no idea she had just locked a master builder inside the very foundation of her crumbling empire. I stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs and listened to the deadbolt slide into place. The cellar smelled of wet concrete and rotting wood. It was a space designed for forgotten things. Now I was one of them. The muffled sound of heavy bass and clinking glasses filtered through the ceiling. My daughter and her husband were drinking expensive champagne. They were celebrating the fortune they thought they had just stolen from me. I looked at the thin mattress they had tossed on the floor. It had no blankets. The furnace was turned off. The winter chill seeped directly through the foundation walls. I reached into my pocket for my phone. There was no service. The thick concrete walls completely blocked the signal. I was entirely isolated from the outside world. Any normal 70-year-old man would have sat on that bare mattress and wept. I did not cry. I am a master builder. I have spent my entire life turning raw materials into structures that withstand hurricanes. I do not panic in the dark. I walked the perimeter of my concrete cage. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, provided by a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed wire. I traced my fingers along the foundation. I noted the poor insulation. I noted the shoddy electrical work. Brian had built a mansion that looked like a palace on the outside, but was rotting from the inside. It was the perfect metaphor for his entire life. The air in the basement was thick and stale. I needed proper circulation. I needed to hear exactly what was happening upstairs. I spotted a heavy industrial ventilation grate near the ceiling in the far corner. It was partially blocked by a massive stack of dusty cardboard moving boxes. I moved the boxes methodically. I dragged them across the concrete floor without making a single sound. I climbed onto the sturdiest box to reach the grate. I did not have my tool belt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the same dull quarter I had used to scratch the lottery ticket. I wedged the edge of the coin into the flathead screws holding the metal grate to the wall. The screws were rusted tight. My fingers cramped from the cold, but years of gripping heavy lumber had given me a grip like a vice. I turned the coin slowly. The first screw broke loose, then the second. I carefully lowered the heavy iron grate to the floor. Fresh air poured into the basement. The voices from the floor above became perfectly clear. As I stepped down from the boxes, my boot kicked something solid hidden behind the bottom stack. I pushed the remaining cardboard aside. Pushed deep into the darkest corner of the cellar, perfectly concealed from casual view, was a heavy black plastic storage bin. It was secured with a thick brass padlock. Brian was a man who cared about appearances. He kept his home immaculate. He would not leave a locked container in a damp basement unless he was terrified of someone finding it. I looked at the brass padlock. A lock only stops an honest man. I picked up the heavy iron vent grate I had just removed from the wall. I wrapped it in an old dirty towel I found near the water heater to muffle the sound. I brought the heavy iron down on the brass padlock with a precise calculated strike. The metal snapped open with a dull crack. I lifted the lid. The bin was not filled with old family photos or winter coats. It was filled with thick, black financial ledgers. There were dozens of manila folders stuffed with bank statements, printed emails, and legal notices. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, directly under the single bare light bulb. I opened the first ledger. I have managed construction budgets for multi-million-dollar high-rise projects. I know how to read a balance sheet. I know how to spot a lie hidden in a spreadsheet. I opened the books and began to read. The numbers did not make sense at first. Brian owned a chain of suburban gas stations and a mid-sized logistics company. His public image was that of a thriving entrepreneur. The ledgers told a completely different story. I traced the flow of money. His businesses were bleeding cash. They had been operating at a massive loss for over 3 years. But it was not just bad business management. Brian was siphoning money out of his own companies to fund something else. I dug deeper into the folders. I found handwritten notes tracking massive wire transfers to offshore accounts. I found threatening letters demanding immediate payment. These were not letters from traditional banks. These were not warnings from the tax authorities. I found a separate folder labeled with a single red marker. I opened it. Inside were promissory notes tied to an illegal underground syndicate. The interest rates were astronomical. The terms were brutally aggressive. Brian had borrowed heavily from dangerous men to maintain the illusion of his wealth. The total debt was staggering. He owed $15 million. I kept digging through the papers. I needed to understand how my daughter fit into this nightmare. I found a printed email chain between Natalie and her father-in-law Leonard. The dates were from just 2 weeks ago. Leonard was a retired investment banker. He was sharp and he was ruthless. The emails showed that Leonard had demanded an audit of Brian's companies. He suspected his son was committing federal tax fraud and was threatening to expose him to the authorities to protect his own reputation. Then I found a bank draft receipt clipped to the emails. It was a withdrawal for exactly $20,000 from Natalie's private account. The memo line was marked for a Mediterranean cruise package. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The lavish gift she had presented to Leonard at the barbecue was not a gesture of love. It was a desperate bribe. It was hush money designed to distract him and buy them time. Natalie was completely complicit. She knew her husband was a criminal and she was actively helping him cover his tracks. I reached the bottom of the black plastic bin. I found a single piece of heavy parchment paper. It was a final notice from the syndicate. It was not formatted like a corporate letter. It was a blunt, terrifying threat. It stated that the $15 million debt was due in full by the end of the month. The notice explicitly promised that if the funds were not secured, they would seize his companies, seize his mansion, and hold him personally accountable in ways that the law could not protect him from. The deadline was exactly 4 days away. I sat back against the cold concrete wall, the pieces of the puzzle locked together with terrifying clarity. The midnight invasion of my apartment was not just about basic greed. It was about absolute survival. Natalie and Brian were drowning. They were cornered animals facing total destruction at the hands of violent criminals. When they saw the news broadcast about the winning lottery ticket sold at Brian's gas station, they saw their only way out. They did not just want my $190 million so they could buy more sports cars. They needed my money to save their own lives. They were planning to hand my massive fortune directly over to an underworld syndicate to erase their catastrophic mistakes. And if I stood in their way, they would not hesitate to eliminate me completely. The stakes were no longer about an ungrateful daughter disrespecting her father. I was locked in a basement with 2 desperate criminals, and I held the only key to their survival. Morning came to the cellar, not with sunlight, but with a slow, creeping grayness that filtered through the dirty glass of the high window. I had not slept. I spent the remaining hours of the night memorizing the names and numbers in the black financial ledgers I found hidden behind the cardboard boxes. I committed every offshore account routing number and every syndicate loan deadline to memory. When I was finished, I carefully placed the ledgers back inside the heavy plastic bin. I pressed the broken brass padlock together so it looked intact from a distance and pushed the boxes back into their original formation. I sat on the thin, cold mattress on the concrete floor and waited. I knew my daughter would not waste any time. The syndicate deadline was breathing down their necks. They needed my money today. At exactly 8 in the morning, heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor above my head. They stopped directly above the cellar entrance. The loud metallic scrape of the exterior deadbolt sliding backward echoed down the dark stairwell. The heavy door swung open, and a harsh beam of yellow hallway light sliced through the dusty air of the basement. I remained seated on the mattress. I let my shoulders slump forward and practiced slowing my breathing to mimic the rhythm of a frail and exhausted old man. Heavy leather heels tapped against the wooden stairs. Natalie descended into the cellar. She was dressed in a pristine white cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, looking as though she were preparing for a high society brunch rather than locking her father in a dungeon. In one hand, she carried a flimsy paper cup filled with lukewarm black coffee. In her other hand, she clutched a thick manila folder bursting with densely printed legal documents. She did not look at the damp walls or the exposed plumbing. She did not ask how I slept on the concrete floor. She walked over to where I sat and dropped the cheap paper cup onto a dusty wooden crate next to the mattress. She told me to drink up and wake up because we had a lot of important work to do. Her voice was artificially sweet. It was the same tone she used when she wanted me to pay for her expensive summer camps when she was a teenager. I looked up at her with wide, tired eyes. I asked her what the papers were for and why I could not come upstairs to eat breakfast. She ignored my question about breakfast. She opened the manila folder and spread the thick stack of papers across the top of the wooden crate. She told me that claiming a massive lottery jackpot was an incredibly complicated legal process. She claimed the state tax authorities would seize more than half of my winnings if the money was not routed through a proper corporate management fund immediately. She said she and Brian had stayed up all night speaking with elite financial advisors to protect my newfound wealth. All I needed to do, she explained, was sign a standard family management form. She promised this simple signature would allow Brian to handle the stressful banking logistics on my behalf, so I could just relax and enjoy my retirement. I stared at the papers. I recognized the dense legal formatting immediately. It was a broad power of attorney contract, giving the designated representative absolute and unchecked authority to liquidate assets, transfer wealth, and assume total control over my financial identity. If I were a genuinely naive old man, signing that document would have erased my independence forever. I looked back at Natalie. I let my voice tremble. I told her I did not feel comfortable signing legal documents without reading them first. I asked her if we could just call my old friend Oliver to look them over since he was a lawyer. The fake sweetness vanished from her face instantly. Her jaw clenched and her eyes hardened into two cold, dark stones. She stepped closer to me, towering over my seated position on the mattress. She told me that Oliver was a washed-up hack who did not understand high-level wealth management. She said we did not have time to wait for second opinions. The Lottery Commission required immediate action. I shook my head slowly and looked down at my hands. I told her I was tired and confused, and I just wanted to go back to my own apartment. That was the exact moment my daughter revealed the absolute darkness in her heart. She leaned down until her face was inches from mine. She lowered her voice to a harsh, menacing whisper. She told me that if I refused to sign the documents right now, she would pick up her phone and call a state-appointed psychiatrist. She promised she would tell the medical board that I had been wandering the streets at night, talking to people who were not there, and leaving the gas stove running. She said she would testify under oath that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and was a danger to myself and others. She did not stop there. She smiled a cruel, twisted smile and detailed exactly what would happen next. She told me the state would strip me of my rights and place me in a locked psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. She said the courts would automatically grant her full medical and financial conservatorship over me anyway. She made it perfectly clear that she was going to take the $190 million whether I cooperated or not. The only choice I had was whether I wanted to spend my final years living comfortably under her control or locked in a sterile white room, eating pureed food and heavily medicated until I forgot my own name. It took every ounce of discipline I had built over 70 years of life not to stand up and shatter her arrogant reality right then and there. But a master builder knows that you never strike a wall until the load-bearing pillars are perfectly in place. I had to let her believe she had completely broken my spirit. I forced my breathing to become rapid and shallow. I made my hands shake violently. I looked up at her with tears welling in my eyes. I begged her not to put me in a home. I pleaded with her, telling her I would do whatever she wanted as long as she did not lock me away in a hospital. Natalie stood up straight and smoothed the wrinkles from her cashmere sweater. She looked down at me with an expression of absolute disgust and ultimate victory. She pulled an expensive silver pen from her pocket and tossed it onto the wooden crate next to the documents. She pointed to the bottom of the final page. She told me to stop whining and sign on the dotted line. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I let my hand hover over the paper, trembling uncontrollably. I pressed the ink to the page and slowly, shakily traced my signature on the bottom line. I did not just sign the top page. She flipped through the thick packet, making me sign every single required addendum and liability waiver. When the final page was signed, she snatched the folder off the crate with lightning speed. She checked the signatures, verifying that every line was filled. A massive, greedy smile spread across her face. She looked at me sitting on the cold floor. She told me to drink my coffee and keep quiet because she had a very busy day ahead of her. She turned her back and walked up the wooden stairs. She did not look back. The heavy metal door slammed shut. The loud metallic clank of the deadbolt locking me inside echoed through the basement. I was plunged back into the cold, damp darkness. The moment the lock clicked into place, my hands stopped trembling completely. My posture straightened. I stood up from the filthy mattress and brushed the dust from my trousers. I walked over to the wooden crate and poured the lukewarm coffee directly into the dirt. My daughter believed she had just forced me to sign away my fortune and my freedom. She had absolutely no idea what she had actually carried into this basement. When Oliver and I sat in that 24-hour diner the night before, We did not just build a blind trust. Oliver knew exactly how ruthless corporate predators operated. He knew Brian and Natalie would try to force me to sign a power of attorney mandate. Oliver had reached into his briefcase and handed me a perfectly forged set of standard financial management documents. They looked identical to the standard forms any major bank would provide. But hidden deep within the dense legal jargon of page 7 was a strategically modified reverse liability clause that Oliver had drafted himself. By forcing me to sign those specific documents, and then counter-signing them as my legal representatives, Brian and Natalie were not gaining access to my lottery winnings. They were legally binding themselves to a catastrophic agreement. The clause explicitly stated that the designated representatives voluntarily assumed full personal and financial liability for any and all debts owed by the signatory. They thought they were taking my money. In reality, they were legally tying their own necks to a massive anvil. I reached down to my sturdy work boot. I pulled up the heavy leather seam and extracted a small encrypted burner phone that Oliver had given me before we parted ways. The concrete walls blocked normal cellular signals, but this device operated on a specialized satellite frequency designed for secure corporate communications. The screen glowed faintly in the dark cellar. I opened the messaging application. I selected the single encrypted contact saved in the directory. I did not write a long explanation. I did not express fear or hesitation. I typed 4 simple words to let Oliver know the foundation of our trap was perfectly set. The bait is taken. I pressed send and watched the message encrypt and transmit. I turned off the screen and plunged the cellar back into total darkness. My daughter thought she had buried me. She had actually just handed me the shovel to dig her own grave. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the cellar and listened to the heavy silence of the house. Hours had passed since Natalie snatched the forged legal documents from my hands and locked me back in the dark. I knew Brian was not upstairs celebrating. He had taken the fake lottery ticket and the newly signed power of attorney papers and driven straight into the belly of the beast. He was meeting with the men who held his life in their hands. I leaned my head against the damp foundation wall and waited for the inevitable impact. Brian was always a man who confused reckless leverage with actual wealth. I remembered when he first married my daughter. He drove a leased European sports car he could barely afford and wore suits that cost more than his monthly salary. When he bought his chain of suburban gas stations, he did not use careful savings. He used toxic loans with terrible interest rates. He wanted the world to look at him and see a king. The illegal underworld syndicate he now owed $15 million was simply the inevitable conclusion of a life built entirely on financial quicksand. Through the loosened iron vent grate near the ceiling, I finally heard the heavy front door slam shut. Brian had returned from his meeting. His footsteps across the hardwood floor were not the confident strides of a victorious man. They were the erratic, heavy stomps of a terrified animal. He was shouting for Natalie before he even reached the kitchen. The panic in his voice was absolute and unfiltered. I stood up and moved closer to the vent, pressing my ear toward the flow of fresh air so I could capture every single word of his failure. Brian rapidly explained what happened at the meeting. He had walked into a bleak warehouse office carrying his expensive leather briefcase. He had presented the flawless forged ticket and the power of attorney documents I had signed. He fully expected the syndicate bosses to smile, shake his hand, and give him all the time in the world to claim the massive jackpot. He was completely wrong. The syndicate was run by a man named Silas. Silas did not smile. He did not care about pieces of printed cardboard or legal promises written by desperate men. Silas dealt in hard currency and brute force. He looked at the documents and told Brian that promises do not pay astronomical interest rates. He explained that legitimate banks do not lend millions of dollars overnight based on a lottery ticket that has not yet been officially validated by the state commission. The creditors rejected the collateral entirely. They gave Brian a brutal and non-negotiable ultimatum. He had exactly 48 hours to provide undeniable proof of massive liquid wealth. If the funds were not secured by the deadline, the syndicate would take everything by force. Silas detailed the exact mechanics of their destruction. He promised that if Brian failed, armed men would arrive at the logistics company and chain the doors shut. They would violently seize the titles to the gas stations. They would take the mansion, the cars, and leave Brian and Natalie with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. When Brian finished recounting the meeting, Natalie gasped loudly. I heard the sharp sound of breaking glass above me as she dropped a coffee mug onto the hardwood floor. Her composed and arrogant facade shattered completely. Natalie did not cry or offer her husband comfort. Her reaction was a cold and vicious anger. She screamed at Brian, blaming him for being weak and stupid. She blamed him for borrowing money from violent street thugs instead of legitimate banks. She demanded to know how they were going to survive the next 2 days. The real lottery money, even if they could process it, would take at least a week to clear the state bureaucracy. Brian paced the floor frantically. I could hear his heavy shoes marching back and forth across the ceiling, directly above me. Then Brian revealed his desperate strategy. It was a plan born of pure arrogance and absolute panic. He told Natalie that sharks only back down when they think they are facing a much larger predator. To survive the 48-hour deadline, they needed to project an image of untouchable, massive wealth. They needed to convince Silas and the syndicate that the lottery money was already flowing and that they were too powerful to be intimidated. Brian declared they were going to throw an obscenely lavish $1 million gala the very next night right here at the estate. Brian spent the next few hours making dozens of frantic phone calls. I listened as he contacted high-end event planners and elite caterers. He lied to them with terrifying ease, promising to pay double their usual rates if they could transform the mansion by the next evening. He ordered massive ice sculptures, professional lighting rigs, and a full premium valet service. He invited the city mayor, local business leaders, and the social elite. More importantly, he made absolutely sure Silas and the syndicate lieutenants received VIP invitations to witness his fabricated empire firsthand. When the sun came up the next morning, my concrete prison vibrated with the chaotic sounds of a desperate illusion being constructed. Truck after truck pulled into the long, winding driveway. Through the small, dirty glass window near the ceiling of the basement, I watched the heavy boots of dozens of workers walking past. Men carried massive crates of expensive sound equipment. Caterers unloaded boxes of premium champagne and imported caviar. Florists dragged towering arrangements of rare orchids and white roses across the gravel. Brian was paying for all of it on massive credit. The irony of the situation was almost poetic. I was the man who truly controlled a $190 million empire. Yet I sat on a filthy mattress on a cold concrete floor, drinking dirty tap water from a paper cup. Meanwhile, my captors were burning money they did not actually have, trying to impress criminals who were actively planning their total destruction. I used the hours of chaos to sit quietly and review the mental map I had made of Brian's financial ledgers. I ensured every number and deadline was permanently locked in my memory. A master builder knows that you do not just knock down a load-bearing wall. You locate the exact stress point where the entire structure bears its heaviest weight. Brian's stress point was his overwhelming vanity. The $1 million gala was not a clever solution to his syndicate problem. It was a massive and highly visible target painted directly on his own back. By inviting violent predators into his home and parading fake wealth in front of them, he was removing any chance of a quiet escape. He was building his own execution chamber. Evening finally fell, and the atmosphere in the house changed completely. The heavy thumping bass of a live jazz orchestra began to vibrate deeply through the concrete foundation. The muffled sounds of clinking crystal glasses and loud, arrogant laughter filtered through my iron vent. The party had begun. Brian and Natalie were upstairs, playing the perfect hosts, smiling and pouring expensive wine for the very people who intended to destroy them. Then I heard heavy footsteps approaching the basement door. I moved quietly away from the vent and sat back down on my mattress. The exterior deadbolt did not unlock, Instead, I heard Natalie speaking in the hallway. She was not alone. She was talking to a man with a deep and authoritative voice. I immediately recognized the harsh professional tone of a private security director. Natalie spoke with chilling ease, her lies flowing like cold water. She told the head of security that she had a deeply mentally unstable relative confined to the lower level. She painted a tragic and totally false picture of a dangerous old man who suffered from severe delusions and aggressive outbursts. Natalie gave the security director strict, absolute orders. She told him that under no circumstances was the basement door to be opened tonight. She warned him that the old man might pound on the metal door or shout desperate lies for help. She instructed the guard to completely ignore anything he heard. She insisted that releasing him would cause a violent and dangerous scene in front of their elite guests. The security director agreed without hesitation, promising to place a dedicated guard at the top of the stairs for the entire duration of the gala. The sound of their footsteps faded back down the hallway toward the grand ballroom. The final piece of their trap had clicked into place. I was completely locked down in the freezing dark, guarded by men paid to ignore my existence. Above me, my enemies were feasting on expensive delicacies, completely blinded by their own desperate illusion. They truly believed they had bought themselves more time. They did not realize that the syndicate deadline was still ticking, and that I was sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the foundation out from under them. The time for waiting in the freezing dark was completely over. The foundation of their trap was perfectly laid, and now I had to walk into the light to spring it. I stood up slowly and approached the heavy metal door at the top of the cellar stairs. I pressed my ear against the cold surface. I could clearly hear the low, rough voices of the two private security guards stationed just on the other side in the hallway. They were complaining about the catering spread, completely unaware of the prisoner standing mere inches away from them. Natalie had ordered them to guard the exterior cellar doors and keep the crazy old man locked away from her elite guests. Breaking through that door by sheer force was absolutely impossible. I was a 70-year-old man facing armed professional security, but I am also a master builder. I have spent my entire life understanding exactly how structures are put together. And more importantly, I know exactly how to take them apart. A locked deadbolt is a formidable obstacle only if you are trying to open a door the way it was designed to be opened. But a door is merely a heavy piece of wood suspended within a wooden frame by metal hinges. Brian had hired cheap, incompetent contractors to finish the basement of his lavish mansion. They had installed the door to open inward toward the cellar. That meant the heavy iron hinge barrels and their steel pins were exposed entirely on my side of the frame. I did not need a key to escape my concrete cage. I just needed to dismantle the architecture of my prison. I walked back down the wooden stairs and searched the dark corners of the basement. I ran my hands along the dusty concrete floor until I found a heavy, rusted framing nail lying abandoned near the hot water heater. It was thick and solid, the perfect makeshift chisel for a desperate man. I sat down and pulled off my right heavy leather work boot. The thick, solid rubber heel would serve perfectly as a muffled hammer. I crept back up the stairs with the absolute silence of a ghost. I placed my stocking foot carefully on the very edge of the wooden steps to avoid making a single creaking sound that might alert the men standing on the other side. As I positioned the tip of the rusted nail against the bottom of the lower hinge pin, I gripped my heavy leather boot firmly and brought the rubber heel down against the head of the nail in a swift, controlled strike. The thick rubber completely absorbed the sharp sound of the impact. The steel pin slid upward a fraction of an inch. I struck it again, maintaining a steady, rhythmic pressure. The pin popped free from the barrel. I caught it in my palm before it could fall and hit the floor. I repeated the exact same meticulous process on the top hinge. My muscles burned from the awkward angle, but my hands remained perfectly steady. The guards on the other side continued laughing and talking, completely oblivious to the fact that the barrier separating us was being systematically uninstalled. With both metal pins removed, the heavy door was no longer attached to the wall. It was only held in place by the friction of the deadbolt locking into the frame. I put my boot back on and laced it up tight. I pressed my shoulder against the solid wood. I gripped the cold brass handle with both hands. I braced my legs against the top step and pulled backward with steady, immense force. The heavy door slid horizontally out of the frame. The thick deadbolt slipped silently out of the metal strike plate. I lowered the massive slab of wood to the cellar floor with agonizing slowness, my chest heaving from the immense physical strain. The doorway was completely open. I slipped through the empty frame and bypassed the guards, entirely melting into the shadows of the hallway. Brian had built this sprawling suburban estate to mimic the grand mansions of the old world. That meant he had insisted on a labyrinth of service corridors designed to keep the hired help completely out of sight. I knew the blueprints of homes exactly like this. I navigated the narrow, dimly lit hallways with absolute precision. I moved past the bustling main kitchen, listening to the frantic shouts of the hired caterers plating the expensive appetizers. I remained entirely in the shadows until I reached the massive white-tiled laundry room at the very back of the estate. Oliver is a man who leaves absolutely nothing to chance. He knew I would need to make a public entrance to shatter Brian's illusion, and he knew I could not do it wearing the dirty, wrinkled clothes of a frail old man. He had utilized his extensive network of corporate fixers to infiltrate Brian's party preparations hours before the first guest arrived. Oliver had bribed the external linen service contracted for the gala. Sitting in the corner of the laundry room, perfectly hidden beneath a stack of freshly pressed white tablecloths, was a sleek black garment bag. I pulled the heavy bag from the laundry cart and unzipped it. Inside was a bespoke, tailored tuxedo. It was not a cheap rental suit. It was a masterpiece of dark, midnight blue fabric with a crisp white dress shirt, a black silk bow tie, and perfectly polished leather shoes. I walked over to the deep utility sink and washed the grime and sweat from my face. I scrubbed my hands until my skin was raw, washing away the smell of the damp concrete cellar and the grease of the hinge pins. I stripped off my worn work trousers and my faded, dusty shirt. I dressed myself in the tailored suit. The expensive fabric fit my shoulders perfectly. The expert cut of the jacket forced me to stand taller, to pull my chest forward, to carry myself with the immense gravity I truly possessed. I tied the silk bow tie with steady, practiced hands. I slipped my feet into the polished shoes. I looked at my reflection in the gleaming metal surface of a commercial washing machine. The frail, frightened old man Natalie had locked in the basement was completely dead. The man staring back at me was a predator. I was a man who legally controlled a $190 million empire, and I was finally dressed for a hostile corporate takeover. I walked out of the laundry room and moved toward the front of the house. I did not hide in the shadows anymore. I walked directly down the main corridor with the absolute authority of a man who owned the very floor beneath his feet. A passing waiter carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes quickly stepped out of my way, assuming I was an eccentric billionaire guest who had wandered away from the party. The heavy rhythmic music grew louder with every single step. The sound of hundreds of voices blending into a wall of arrogant noise washed over me. I reached the towering double doors of the grand ballroom. They were made of heavy mahogany and trimmed with polished gold leaf. I stood just outside the entrance and listened carefully. The live jazz orchestra had stopped playing. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd died down to a respectful hush. Brian was standing on the grand stage at the far end of the room, speaking into a crystal-clear microphone. His voice echoed through the massive space, dripping with absolute vanity and reckless, unearned confidence. Brian spoke to the crowd about his incredible vision for the future. He thanked the local mayor and the elite business leaders for attending his impromptu celebration. He confidently acknowledged the quiet, dangerous men standing in the back of the room, the men sent by Silas to collect the syndicate debt. Brian puffed out his chest and raised a glass of expensive champagne high into the air. He boldly announced that his family had just secured a massive, unprecedented financial victory. He declared in a booming voice that they were officially stepping into an era of untouchable incoming generational wealth. He promised the captivated crowd that this beautiful night was just the very beginning of their glorious empire. I placed my hands flat against the polished mahogany doors. I pushed them open with a slow, deliberate, and unstoppable force. The heavy doors swung wide, revealing the blinding light and the sheer sickening opulence of the grand ballroom. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a glittering glow over the hundreds of guests dressed in expensive gowns and sharp suits. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the room. I did not rush. I walked with a slow, measured, heavy stride. The loud clinking of crystal glasses stopped instantly. A woman standing near the entrance gasped softly as I walked past her. The silence began to spread through the massive room like a highly contagious virus. The guests nearest to me stopped talking and turned to stare. They parted like the Red Sea, stepping back to create a wide, clear path directly down the center of the ballroom. The imposing, sharply dressed 70-year-old man commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The deafening silence rushed all the way to the front of the stage. Brian stood completely frozen behind the microphone. His arm was still raised high in the air, his glass of champagne shaking violently in his grip. The smug, arrogant smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Natalie stood beside him, her face completely drained of blood. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she stared at the father she believed she had buried in the dark. The trap was fully sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Brian's trembling fingers. It shattered against the polished oak stage, sending glittering shards across the floor. That sharp, violent crack broke the spell holding the massive ballroom hostage. The stunned silence vanished. Natalie reacted with the pure, desperate instinct of a cornered predator. She did not freeze in shock. She weaponized her lies instantly. She rushed to the edge of the stage and pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. She screamed at the top of her lungs, ordering the private security team to grab me. She cried out to the horrified guests that her father was having a severe, violent dementia episode. She sobbed fake tears, claiming I had escaped my medical caregivers and was a dangerous threat to myself and everyone in the room. Two massive men in dark suits shoved their way through the crowd of terrified socialites. They lunged toward me with their hands outstretched, ready to tackle an old man to the hard marble floor. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still in my tailored tuxedo, waiting for the next structural pillar to snap into place. A booming, authoritative voice echoed from the back of the ballroom, ordering the guards to freeze. Oliver stepped out from the shadows of the arched entryway. He was not alone. Flanking him were two imposing, uniformed city police officers he had hired hours earlier for private protection. Oliver marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. He held a thick legal document high in the air. He did not look like a washed-up hack. He looked like an executioner. Oliver flashed a federal injunction directly into the faces of the private security guards. He informed them in a cold, deadly tone that I was a protected federal witness and the sole beneficiary of a legally protected trust. He warned them that laying a single finger on my suit would result in immediate federal kidnapping and aggravated assault charges. The private guards stopped dead in their tracks. They looked at Oliver. They looked at the heavy-duty belts of the real police officers. They backed away slowly and melted back into the whispering crowd. They were paid to stop unruly party guests, not to fight federal injunctions. Natalie's fabricated panic turned into genuine, choking terror. Her fake tears dried up instantly. She realized her expensive security force was completely neutralized. She looked at the police officers and then stared at Oliver in pure disbelief. She finally recognized the brilliant lawyer she had dismissed as a fool. I walked past the paralyzed security guards. I walked up the 3 wooden steps to the grand stage. Brian stood frozen behind the microphone stand. He was sweating profusely. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked at the heavy leather boots I wore with my tuxedo. He finally understood that the frail, frightened old man he had locked in the cellar was an illusion. I stopped inches away from him. I did not yell. I did not show anger. I simply reached out and took the crystal microphone directly from his wet, trembling hand. He let it go without a single ounce of resistance. I turned to face the hundreds of wealthy guests. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I looked at the local mayor sitting in the front row. I looked at the business elites holding their expensive drinks. Then I looked past all of them. I looked at the back of the room near the heavy mahogany doors. I locked eyes with the quiet, dangerous men Silas had sent to collect the $15 million syndicate debt. They were not mingling. They were watching Brian with cold, dead eyes. I spoke into the microphone. My voice was calm, steady, and carried the absolute weight of a master builder inspecting a condemned building. I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate my family tonight. I told them Brian had been absolutely right about his incoming generational wealth. The crowd murmured in confusion. I let the tension build. I told the captivated audience that claiming a massive lottery jackpot was an incredibly complicated legal process. I explained that it required absolute secrecy and ironclad legal protection. I turned my head and looked directly at Natalie. She was trembling uncontrollably. She knew exactly what I was about to say. She knew the trap had snapped shut around her throat. I explained to the crowd that traditional banking was far too risky for such a massive fortune. I announced that the winning ticket had not been deposited into a standard joint checking account. I stated clearly that the $190 million prize had been legally claimed 3 days ago. A loud collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Brian stepped backward and bumped into the drum set of the jazz orchestra. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He shook his head frantically, silently begging me to stop talking. I did not stop. I spoke directly to the syndicate men in the back of the room, ensuring my voice echoed clearly from every speaker in the mansion. I announced that the money was currently secured behind 3 layers of corporate shell companies in a blind charity trust. I introduced Oliver to the crowd, naming him as the sole legal trustee of the newly established foundation. I explained that my name and my daughter's name were entirely erased from the public record of the winnings. We had absolutely no legal access to a single dime of the money. Brian fell to his knees on the stage. The realization hit him with the force of a falling steel beam. The massive illusion he had built to hold off his violent creditors was collapsing right in front of them. He had promised the underworld syndicate that he controlled the winning ticket. He had invited them to this lavish party to prove his untouchable wealth. And now the true owner of the fortune was publicly declaring that Brian had zero access to the funds. I walked over to where Brian knelt on the polished wood. I leaned down, keeping the microphone close to my mouth. I needed Silas's men to hear the final nail being driven into the coffin. I asked Brian if he remembered locking the winning ticket inside his expensive leather briefcase. I asked him if he felt powerful when he locked me in the damp basement. Brian looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. He nodded slowly. He still believed he held the golden ticket as collateral. He still thought he could run upstairs to his biometric safe and hand the physical ticket over to the syndicate to save his own life. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had survived the darkest storms and emerged with a heart made of solid iron. I spoke my final words into the microphone. I told Brian that the ticket currently sitting in his safe, the ticket he had pledged to violent men to save his miserable life, was nothing more than a high-resolution color replica. I stated clearly that it was a piece of worthless printed cardboard. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and terrifying. It was the sound of a massive structure seconds before a total collapse. The wealthy socialites in the front rows began to whisper frantically to one another. They looked at Brian kneeling on the floor, and then at Natalie, who was gripping the edge of the stage curtains to keep herself from falling. The illusion of their royal suburban empire was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I kept my eyes locked on the men at the back of the ballroom. The syndicate enforcers did not look surprised. They looked angry, very angry. One of them, a tall man with a scarred neck, pulled a cell phone from his tailored jacket and began dialing a number. He did not take his eyes off Brian. Silas was getting the news immediately. The 48-hour deadline Brian had begged for was officially over. By proving he had lied about the collateral, Brian had just accelerated his own execution. Natalie finally found her voice. She scrambled across the stage toward me, ignoring the horrified stares of her elite friends. She grabbed my tuxedo jacket with clawing, desperate fingers. She hissed at me through gritted teeth, completely abandoning her fake, loving daughter persona. She reminded me of the power of attorney documents I had signed in the basement that very morning. She screamed that she and Brian were my legal financial representatives. She claimed they could still compel the trust to release the funds. She thought she still had a hidden ace up her sleeve. I looked down at her hands gripping my lapels. I gently but firmly removed her fingers from my jacket. I stepped back and spoke into the microphone once again, ensuring Oliver could hear the culmination of his brilliant legal trap. I told Natalie that she should have read the fine print on page 7 of those standard family management forms. I explained that she had not signed a document granting her access to my wealth. She had signed a strategically modified reverse liability clause. I detailed the trap for the entire ballroom to hear. By forcing me to sign those specific documents and then counter-signing them as my legal representatives, she and Brian had legally bound themselves to a catastrophic agreement. I explained that the clause explicitly stated the designated representatives voluntarily assumed full personal and financial liability for any and all debts owed by the signatory. Natalie stared at me blankly. Her mind was struggling to process the dense legal reality. I made it incredibly simple for her. I announced that I had used Oliver's connections to quietly purchase a massive amount of high-risk toxic debt hours before the party began. I had taken out millions of dollars in terrible loans under my own name using the blind trust as leverage. And thanks to the documents she and Brian had forced me to sign in the dark that morning, they were now entirely responsible for paying back every single penny of that new toxic debt. They had wanted to steal my fortune to pay off the syndicate. Instead, they had just legally inherited a massive mountain of new crushing financial liabilities. They were not just broke. They were buried under a legal avalanche they could never escape. They had literally signed their own financial death warrants trying to steal my life. Brian let out a guttural, agonizing scream. He buried his face in his hands on the stage floor. He knew the syndicate men were watching his total destruction. He knew they would take his gas stations. They would take his logistics company. They would take this very mansion before the sun came up. He had tried to play a high-stakes game with violent predators, and he had lost everything. Oliver walked up to the edge of the stage. The 2 uniformed police officers stood guard behind him, keeping the whispering crowd at bay. Oliver looked at Brian and Natalie with absolute professional disgust. He held up a second document. He announced loudly that it was a formal eviction notice filed on behalf of the blind trust. I had not just purchased toxic debt. I had instructed Oliver to quietly buy the heavily leveraged mortgage on this very estate while Brian was busy ordering ice sculptures. I owned the mansion. I owned the very stage they were crying on. And I was officially kicking them out of my house. The guests began to filter out of the grand ballroom. They did not say goodbye. They did not thank their hosts for the expensive champagne or the imported caviar. They recognized a sinking ship, and they fled toward the valet, parking as fast as their expensive shoes could carry them. The jazz orchestra packed up their instruments in awkward silence. The $1 million gala had turned into a public execution. I looked at my daughter. She was sitting on the wooden floor of the stage, completely ruined. Her pristine white dress was wrinkled. Her carefully styled hair was falling into her tear-stained face. She looked up at me expecting to find pity, or perhaps a lingering ounce of parental weakness. She found absolutely nothing. I had spent 70 years building strong foundations, and I refused to let her rot destroy the rest of my life. The syndicate enforcers at the back of the room began to walk slowly down the center aisle directly toward the stage. Their heavy footsteps echoed against the marble floors, now empty of the dancing, wealthy elite. They ignored the fleeing guests and the packing musicians. Their target was the man crying on the floor. Brian looked up and saw them coming. His face turned the color of wet ash. He scrambled backward across the polished wood, scraping his expensive suit against the splinters of the shattered champagne flute. He tried to put distance between himself and the men he owed $15 million. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes. He opened his mouth to beg for salvation, to ask for the lottery money, to save his miserable life from the approaching enforcers. But I simply turned my back on him. I adjusted my silk bow tie and walked down the stage steps toward Oliver and the waiting police officers. The master builder had finished his work. The old corrupt structure was completely demolished, and it was finally time to walk out of the dark and leave the rubble behind. Those men did not run when the illusion of wealth shattered. They advanced. The tall enforcer with the scarred neck pocketed his cell phone. His eyes were completely devoid of any human empathy. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a demolition crew arriving to tear down a condemned building. He and 4 other broad-shouldered men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the arched entryway and walked directly down the center aisle. Their heavy footsteps echoed sharply against the polished marble floor. They did not rush. They moved with the terrifying, deliberate pace of predators who knew their prey was completely trapped. They reached the front of the ballroom and surrounded the base of the grand stage, forming an impenetrable human wall of impending violence. The scarred man looked up at Brian. He did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice to command the room. He spoke in a low, gravelly tone that carried perfectly in the dead silence of the ballroom. He told Brian that the 48-hour grace period was officially revoked. He stated clearly that Silas did not appreciate being invited to a suburban circus, and he certainly did not appreciate being offered printed cardboard as collateral for a massive syndicate loan. The enforcer demanded the $15 million right then and there. He made it explicitly clear that if the money was not produced within the next 60 seconds, they were going to start breaking bones and seizing property by force. Brian scrambled backward across the polished oak floor of the stage. His expensive tailored trousers caught on a loose splinter, but he did not stop until his back hit the heavy velvet curtains. He was a cornered rat facing total destruction. His face was slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He screamed at the syndicate men, begging them to listen to him. He shouted that he still had the legal authority to get their money. He shrieked that the things I had just said about anonymous trusts were just the ravings of a bitter old man suffering from a severe mental decline. Brian frantically patted his suit pockets, as if searching for the documents he had locked inside his briefcase. He screamed that he held a signed power of attorney mandate. He promised the enforcers that he was my absolute legal financial representative. He swore on his life that he would force me to liquidate my assets the very next morning. He pleaded with the scarred man to give him just 12 more hours, promising he would use the state courts to drain my accounts and hand the millions directly over to Silas. Brian was desperately clinging to the very trap that was already snapping shut around his neck, completely blinded by panic and unable to realize the steel teeth were already buried deep in his flesh. I stood silently near the stage steps and watched him grovel. I did not need to argue with a desperate liar. I had a master architect of corporate warfare standing right beside me. Oliver adjusted the lapels of his sharp charcoal suit. He walked calmly toward the elaborate audiovisual control podium that Brian had rented for his grand presentation. The gala planners had set up a massive high-definition projection screen directly behind the stage, intended to display the logo of Brian's logistics company while he boasted to the mayor about his wealth. Oliver plugged a sleek black tablet into the podium's central data console. The massive screen behind the stage flickered and hummed to life. A blinding white light washed over Brian and Natalie, casting their pathetic, trembling shadows, long and dark, across the ballroom floor. Oliver tapped the screen of his tablet. An immensely clear digital copy of the legal document Natalie had forced me to sign in the freezing basement that morning appeared on the projection screen. It towered over them 20 feet high, a glowing monument to their own devastating greed. Oliver picked up a spare microphone from the podium. His voice boomed through the premium surround sound speakers, cold, clinical, and absolutely merciless. He addressed Brian directly, treating him not as a human being, but as a hostile corporate entity about to be liquidated. Oliver projected page 7 onto the screen, highlighting the reverse liability clause, so no one in the ballroom could deny what Brian and Natalie had signed. Natalie stared up at the towering screen. Her lips moved silently as she read the glowing words over and over again, her brain finally processing the catastrophic legal reality. She had thought she was holding a gun to my head in that dark cellar. She had thought she was forcing a helpless old man to surrender his fortune. She had not realized Oliver had engineered the weapon to fire backward directly into her own chest. Brian let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. He looked down at the syndicate enforcers surrounding the stage, trying to gauge their reaction to the legal document. But the scarred man at the front did not look impressed by the glowing projection. He looked incredibly annoyed. He interrupted Oliver's presentation, his gravelly voice cutting through the amplified audio. He told the lawyer that he did not care about corporate tricks or legal fine print. He stated bluntly that a piece of paper on a screen did not pay Silas the $15 million. He took a heavy step up onto the first wooden stair of the stage, cracking his knuckles with deliberate, practiced menace. He warned us that if the cash was not produced immediately, the legal technicalities would not matter because Brian would not be breathing long enough to read them. Oliver did not flinch at the violent threat. He actually smiled. It was a terrifying, razor-thin smile that sent a shiver down my spine despite knowing he was my closest ally. Oliver looked directly at the scarred enforcer and agreed with him completely. He stated that Silas was a practical businessman who dealt in hard currency and immediate results, and that the blind trust respected that level of ruthless efficiency. Oliver tapped his tablet one final time. The image of the power of attorney vanished from the massive projection screen. It was instantly replaced by a completely new document. It was a heavy financial contract stamped with official bank seals, routing numbers, and federal transfer codes. It was a comprehensive corporate purchase agreement executed and finalized just 3 hours earlier, while the caterers were still setting up the champagne towers. I stepped forward, my heavy leather boots echoing against the marble floor. I took the microphone from Oliver's hand. I looked down at the syndicate enforcers, then turned to look at my daughter and her husband. I told them that a master builder never leaves a loose end that could compromise the integrity of the foundation. I explained that while Brian was busy parading fake wealth in front of the city elite, Oliver was negotiating directly with Silas's top lieutenants in a secure downtown office. I announced to the silent room that my anonymous blind trust had utilized a fraction of its massive liquid capital to execute a hostile buyout of the underworld debt. We had wired exactly $15 million in untraceable, completely clean funds directly into the syndicate's offshore accounts that very morning. Silas had already received every single penny he was owed, plus a very generous premium to permanently transfer the ledger. The scarred enforcer paused on the wooden steps. He reached into his dark suit jacket and pulled out a ringing cell phone. He listened to the voice on the other end for exactly 5 seconds, nodded once in silent confirmation, and hung up. He looked at me with a newfound expression of profound professional respect. He signaled to his men, and the impenetrable wall of muscle slowly backed away from the stage. The syndicate was paid in full. Their violent business with Brian was officially concluded. They turned and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. Brian let out a massive, tearing sob of absolute relief. He collapsed completely onto the stage floor, weeping openly, his body shaking with the adrenaline of a man who believed he had just been miraculously spared from a brutal execution. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his red face. He whispered desperate words of gratitude, thanking me for paying off the monsters and saving his life. He truly believed his father-in-law had stepped in to rescue him at the final second. I stared down at him, groveling on the floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I raised the microphone and delivered the final crushing blow. I told Brian that he was fundamentally misunderstanding the architecture of the situation. I explained that I had not paid his debt to save him. I had purchased his debt to own him. I pointed to the massive purchase agreement glowing on the screen behind him. The document did not represent a rescue. It represented a complete transfer of ownership. Silas had been paid, and every claim, lien penalty, and enforcement right attached to Brian's $15 million loan now belonged to my blind trust. The men in dark suits were leaving because their business with Brian was finished. Mine was just beginning. Brian and Natalie no longer owed violent creditors who operated in the shadows. They owed a legally protected trust holding documented claims against every company, account, vehicle, and property they controlled. I had not erased Brian's debt. I had simply placed it into hands he could not bribe, deceive, or intimidate. I looked down at him and spoke slowly enough for every guest in the ballroom to understand. You were not saved, Brian. Your creditor changed. Unlike Silas, I did not need violence. I had contracts, court orders, and the full weight of the legal system behind me. The grace period was over. I was demanding immediate collection. Brian scrambled to his feet. His knees knocked together as he looked wildly around the grand ballroom. The syndicate enforcers had marched out the door, but the danger had simply changed shape. He sprinted toward the main entrance. He wanted to run to his expensive sports car and drive away from the nightmare. He wanted to escape the crushing reality of his own stupidity. But the two uniformed off-duty police officers Oliver had hired stepped directly in front of the heavy mahogany doors. They crossed their muscular arms and stared him down. Their expressions were completely blank. They were a solid wall of absolute authority. Brian backed away slowly. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He tried to log into his corporate banking application. The screen loaded with agonizing slowness. When the numbers finally appeared, his face drained of all remaining color. Every single account was locked. A bright red banner across the top of his screen declared a total freeze on all his liquid assets. Oliver stood calmly near the presentation podium. He tapped the microphone to ensure the entire room could hear the mechanics of the legal guillotine they had just triggered. Oliver explained that the blind trust had executed an immediate aggressive lien on all of Brian's holdings. The logistics company was no longer his to control. The chain of suburban gas stations was officially seized by the trust to satisfy the newly acquired $15 million debt. Even the sprawling brick mansion they were standing inside was legally transferring to my foundation by morning. Brian dropped his phone. It bounced on the polished marble floor with a sharp clatter. He had absolutely nothing left. The debt he owed me was a mountain he could never climb. He was a man who had built a kingdom on financial quicksand, and the ground had finally swallowed him whole. The sheer terror inside Brian quickly shifted into a violent, explosive rage. He was a coward who refused to take responsibility for his own failures. He needed someone to blame. He turned slowly toward his wife. Natalie was leaning against the edge of the stage. Her pristine white cashmere dress was wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. Her perfectly styled hair was falling into her tear-streaked face. Brian pointed a trembling, rigid finger directly at her chest. His voice echoed harshly through the massive empty ballroom. He screamed that this catastrophic failure was entirely her fault. Brian shouted that he had just wanted to ignore the lottery ticket. He claimed he had wanted to leave me alone in my old apartment to figure out the money myself. He loudly accused Natalie of being the greedy mastermind behind the entire plot. He turned to the remaining catering staff and the police officers as if they were his jury. He yelled that it was her idea to drag her own father out of bed in the middle of the night. He screamed that she was the one who had suggested throwing me into the freezing, damp basement like a stray dog. He did not stop there. The dam had broken, and years of toxic resentment poured out of him. Brian took a step closer to her. He yelled that her obsession with expensive country club memberships and custom designer clothes had driven him into massive debt in the first place. He blamed her endless shallow vanity for pushing him into the arms of the violent underworld syndicate. He screamed that she was a toxic parasite who had ruined his life. The terrible accusations hung heavily in the cold air of the ballroom. Natalie stopped crying instantly. Her eyes widened in absolute fury. Her facade of the composed, elegant, high-society wife shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She lunged forward with terrifying speed. She raised her right hand and brought it down across Brian's face with incredible force. The sharp, violent sound of the slap cracked like a gunshot through the silent room. Brian stumbled backward from the intense physical impact. A bright red mark blossomed instantly across his pale cheek. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. Natalie screamed back at him. She called him a pathetic, weak coward. She yelled that she had married him because he promised her an untouchable empire, and he had delivered nothing but lies and catastrophic failure. She told him he was entirely useless as a man and as a husband. They stood inches apart on the dance floor, screaming vicious, ugly insults at each other. The perfect, wealthy, suburban marriage they had paraded in front of the city elite dissolved into a pathetic street fight. They tore each other to pieces, verbally stripping away every lie they had ever told. I stood quietly near the stage and watched the rot consume them. I felt no pity. I only felt the quiet satisfaction of a master builder watching a condemned structure finally collapse under its own toxic weight. While my daughter and her husband destroyed each other, I noticed a subtle movement in the dark shadows at the back of the room. Near the kitchen service corridors, a man was trying to slip away unnoticed. It was Leonard. He was Brian's father and Natalie's father-in-law. He was the retired elite investment banker who always looked down his nose at my worn-out work boots and faded shirts. Leonard was walking quickly toward the exit, keeping his head down to avoid attention. Leonard wanted to distance himself from the catastrophic public failure of his son. He wanted to sneak out the back door, return to his own pristine, wealthy life, and pretend this humiliating night had never happened. He thought he could walk away clean from the wreckage. I did not let him reach the door. I walked across the vast ballroom with long, purposeful strides. My heavy leather boots echoed against the marble. I intercepted him just as his hand touched the brass handle of the swinging kitchen door. I placed my large, calloused hand flat against the heavy wood, pushing the door firmly shut. Leonard jumped in surprise. He turned around to face me. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked very tight around his neck. Leonard tried to put on a mask of polite upper-class sympathy. He forced a nervous smile. He told me it was a terrible tragedy to see a family fight like this. He claimed he needed to leave immediately to give us the privacy to sort out our personal issues. I looked at him with the cold, calculating eyes of an architect inspecting a deeply flawed foundation. I told him he was not going anywhere because his own foundation was completely rotten. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. I lowered my voice so only he could hear me over the sound of Brian and Natalie screaming in the background. I asked him if he was enjoying the luxury Mediterranean cruise package Natalie had given him as a gift just 2 weeks ago. Leonard swallowed hard. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead. He tried to act confused and offended. He claimed it was just a generous present from a loving daughter-in-law. I shook my head slowly. I told him Oliver was not just a corporate lawyer who drafted blind trusts. Oliver was a man who possessed a terrifying ability to follow hidden money. I explained that when Oliver dug deep into Brian's accounts to arrange the purchase of the syndicate debt, he had also run a quiet preliminary audit on Leonard's own financial firm. Oliver had traced the routing numbers attached to the cruise ticket directly back to Leonard's personal ledgers. I watched the remaining color drain completely from Leonard's face. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. I explained exactly what Oliver had found hidden in those digital files. Leonard's prestigious investment firm was completely bankrupt. He had been bleeding cash for years, playing the volatile stock market with money that absolutely did not belong to him. His reputation as a financial genius was a total fabrication. I told him the $20,000 Natalie used to buy his silence about Brian's tax fraud was not the only dirty money in his accounts. The rigorous audit proved that Leonard had been secretly embezzling massive funds from his own employees' pension accounts just to keep his failing firm afloat. He had stolen the hard-earned retirement money of honest working people to maintain his personal illusion of extreme wealth. He was a thief dressed in an expensive suit. Leonard began to tremble violently. His confident posture collapsed. The arrogant banker was suddenly just a terrified, desperate old man cornered in a hallway. He realized I held the absolute power to destroy his entire legacy. He knew perfectly well that if I handed Oliver's audit over to federal investigators, he would spend the rest of his natural life locked inside a federal prison. I leaned in closer. I told him the expensive cruise ticket he had happily accepted was paid for with stolen money. That transaction made him an active participant and an accessory to federal financial fraud. The music had stopped long ago. The party was completely dead. I stood firmly blocking the exit and calmly informed Leonard that his time of running away was over. He was going to answer for every single stolen penny. But my focus shifted entirely to the woman standing near the shattered remains of a crystal champagne flute. Natalie was trembling uncontrollably. The pristine white cashmere dress she had worn to humiliate me was now stained and wrinkled, ruined by the chaotic collapse of her fake empire. The heavy diamond necklace around her throat suddenly looked like a tight iron collar. She looked around the cavernous, empty room. She looked at the uniformed police officers guarding the exits. She looked at Oliver, who was calmly placing his legal documents back into his leather briefcase with the detached efficiency of an executioner. The absolute totality of her ruin finally penetrated her arrogant mind. She had no mansion. She had no bank accounts. She had no wealthy friends left to impress. She was facing imminent crushing homelessness, and the only person who possessed the power to save her was the man she had locked in a freezing concrete cage. Her eyes locked onto mine. The cold, venomous glare she had given me in the basement was completely gone. The arrogant, mocking smirk she wore when she handed me that worthless piece of cardboard at the barbecue had evaporated entirely. In their place was a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Her knees buckled beneath her. She did not fall gracefully. She dropped heavily onto the polished oak floor, her expensive heels scraping violently against the wood. She did not stand back up. She began to crawl. My own daughter, the woman who had ordered armed guards to keep me locked in the dark, was dragging herself across the floor toward me. Her manicured hands slipped on the spilled champagne. She ignored the sharp shards of broken crystal that tore at the expensive fabric of her dress and scratched her skin. She reached the spot where I stood and threw herself forward. She grabbed the fabric of my tailored tuxedo trousers with desperate clawing fingers. She began to weep hysterically. The sound echoed through the massive ballroom, high-pitched, ragged, and entirely desperate. She buried her tear-stained face against my leg and began to beg. She pleaded for mercy with the frantic, terrified energy of a drowning victim grasping at a life raft. She cried out that she was deeply sorry, that she had made a terrible mistake, that she had been blinded by Brian and his massive syndicate debts. She begged me not to throw her out into the street. She claimed she had nowhere to go, no money to buy food, no friends who would take her in after such a public humiliation. She swore she would do anything I wanted. She promised she would take care of me, that she would be a good and loyal daughter, that she would spend the rest of her natural life making it up to me. When she realized her tears were not breaking my resolve, she deployed her ultimate, most desperate weapon. She looked up at me, her makeup completely ruined, her eyes wide and pleading. She invoked the memory of her deceased mother. She brought up the woman I had loved and cared for over 4 decades. She cried out that her mother would never want this to happen. She sobbed that her mother would be completely heartbroken to see her only child thrown out into the cold, unforgiving world. She squeezed my leg tighter and screamed that I could not do this to my own flesh and blood. She claimed her mother would beg me to forgive her, to show compassion, to keep the family together, despite everything that had happened. I looked down at the woman gripping my trousers. A normal father might have felt a breaking point in his heart. A normal father might have remembered the little girl he taught to ride a bicycle or the teenager he proudly walked down the aisle. But I am a master builder. I had spent the last 2 days inspecting the completely rotten foundation of her soul, and I knew exactly how structurally compromised she was. I felt absolutely nothing. I felt no pity. I felt no sadness. I felt no lingering parental weakness. Her tears were just salt and water. Her pleas were just empty, meaningless noise. Her invocation of my late wife was not a genuine plea for forgiveness. It was a calculated, disgusting manipulation designed to exploit my grief to save her own skin. I reached down and firmly pried her desperate fingers off my trousers. I stepped back, forcing her to fall flat against the hard wooden floor. I reached into the breast pocket of my midnight blue tuxedo jacket. While Oliver had been busy legally purchasing the syndicate debt and foreclosing on the massive estate, he had also utilized his extensive forensic accounting team to dig into the deepest, darkest corners of my personal finances. He had retrieved exactly what I asked for. I pulled out a thick, tightly folded stack of official bank statements. I did not hand them to her. I tossed the heavy stack of papers directly at her feet. The pages fanned out across the polished wood, coming to rest mere inches from her tear-soaked face. I spoke to her. My voice was completely cold, entirely devoid of emotion, and unwavering in its absolute authority. I told her to stop talking about her mother immediately. I told her she had lost the right to speak my late wife's name the day she decided to treat her grieving father like an expiring financial asset. I pointed to the bank statements scattered on the floor. I explained exactly what they were so there could be no misunderstanding. I told her those pages were a meticulously detailed record of my primary checking account over the last 2 years. I told her I knew exactly what she had been doing with the joint banking mandate she forced me to sign while I was blinded by the grief of losing my wife. She stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting to the black numbers printed on the white pages. I did not let her look away. I narrated her crimes to the empty ballroom. I told her I had seen the steady, systematic, and ruthless withdrawals. I explained how my meager pension, the money I had earned breaking my back on construction sites for 40 hard years, had been quietly siphoned away month after month. I told her I knew the exact dates she transferred my grocery money into her private accounts. I told her I knew exactly what she bought with the funds I needed for basic survival. I looked at the expensive designer handbag resting on a chair near the stage. I told her I knew she had stolen $200 from my winter heating fund in January to buy a matching silk scarf. I told her she had drained $500 from my medical prescription budget in March to purchase a limited edition leather purse. She had literally stolen the food from my table and the medicine from my cabinet so she could parade around her country club pretending to be royalty. She had watched me eat cheap canned soup and shiver in my drafty apartment while she carried my hard-earned pension on her arm. I told her that was the true measure of her character. She did not steal because violent creditors were threatening her life. She did not steal to survive a desperate situation. She stole from a grieving, vulnerable old man simply because she wanted a new accessory to show off to her shallow friends. I told her that her tears on this floor were not tears of regret for what she had done to me. They were tears of absolute terror because she had finally been caught, and because the bank account she had used as her personal piggy bank was now permanently closed. Natalie stared at this bank statements. Her mouth opened, but she had absolutely no lies left to tell. The forensic proof of her prolonged malicious greed was staring her right in the face. She could not blame Brian for this. She could not blame the syndicate or the pressure of incoming debt. This was her own personal calculated cruelty, executed flawlessly over years. She slowly lowered her head until her forehead touched the cold wood of the stage, a completely defeated and ruined creature who had finally run out of victims to exploit. I adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white dress shirt. I looked at the empty, shattered ballroom, and then I looked down at my daughter for the very last time. I delivered the final, undeniable truth of our existence. "You discarded me for $5, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a heavy steel blade. "Now you are not even worth that to me." I did not wait for a response. I did not look back to see her reaction. I turned around and walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, my heavy leather boots echoing against the marble floors with absolute finality. I walked past the silent police officers, pushed open the grand mahogany doors, and stepped out into the cool, fresh air of the night, leaving the falling house and its rotten foundation completely behind me. The sun rose over the sprawling suburban estate, not with warmth, but with a harsh, unforgiving clarity. The manicured lawns and towering oak trees were bathed in a cold, gray morning light. I stood at the end of the long, winding driveway and watched a convoy of heavy vehicles approach. The air was crisp and bitter, biting through the thin fabric of my clothes, but I did not feel the cold. I felt the absolute heat of pure justice. There were no caterers arriving with expensive champagne today. There were no florists carrying rare orchids to decorate the grand halls. Instead, a line of large white moving trucks rumbled up the gravel path, followed closely by 3 marked city police cruisers and the dark sedans of the court bailiffs. The execution of the legal guillotine had officially begun, and I was the architect overseeing the final demolition. I walked up the driveway alongside Oliver and the armed officers. The front doors of the mansion were still wide open from the chaotic exodus of the wealthy guests the night before. The grand foyer was a disaster zone. Shattered crystal glasses littered the polished marble floors. Half-empty bottles of expensive wine were abandoned on velvet chairs. It looked exactly like what it was, a crumbling monument to a fabricated empire. We moved through the first floor with absolute legal authority. The chief bailiff held the eviction mandate high in his hand. His heavy boots echoed through the empty hallways as he announced his presence and demanded immediate compliance. But the house was entirely silent. We reached the base of the grand staircase and looked up. The silence was suddenly broken by the sound of frantic running footsteps on the second floor. Brian and Natalie had not fled into the night. They had nowhere left to run. They had stayed in the house, hoping the nightmare would simply vanish with the dawn. When they heard the heavy voices of the police officers in their foyer, panic took absolute control. They scurried down the upper hallway like cornered rats and sprinted directly into the massive master bedroom. The loud, heavy slam of the solid oak door echoed through the mansion. The sharp, metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place followed immediately after. They were trying to hide from a massive legal avalanche by locking a simple wooden door. I walked slowly up the grand staircase with the bailiffs flanking me. We stood in the wide hallway outside their bedroom. Son. The chief bailiff pounded his heavy fist against the thick oak wood. He announced his official capacity and ordered them to open the door and vacate the premises immediately. He warned them that the property now belonged entirely to my blind trust and that they were officially trespassing. The response from the other side of the door was a desperate, hysterical scream. Natalie shrieked that they were not leaving. She cried out that this was her house, her bedroom, her custom furniture. Brian joined in with a voice completely cracked by terror and rage. He shouted through the heavy wood that if we tried to force our way inside, he would completely destroy the room. He threatened to take a golf club to the imported Italian marble in the master bathroom. He swore he would shatter every custom glass window and rip the expensive hardwood planks directly from the floorboards. He was threatening to violently demolish a property that no longer belonged to him. The chief bailiff turned to me and asked for authorization to proceed with force. I looked at the solid oak door. A master builder knows that a house is only as strong as its framing. Brian had built this mansion for show. He used cheap materials hidden behind expensive veneers. That heavy oak door was mounted on a weak, untreated pine frame. It was a complete illusion of security. I gave the chief bailiff a single firm nod. The officers did not hesitate. 2 heavily armored bailiffs stepped back, measuring the distance with practiced precision. They brought a heavy steel breaching ram directly into the center of the door, just beside the ornate brass handle. The impact sounded like a cannon firing inside the enclosed hallway. The cheap pine doorframe splintered instantly, giving way under the immense kinetic force. Sharp wood fragments exploded into the air, raining down on the plush carpet. The heavy deadbolt ripped completely through the weak molding, tearing the metal strike plate away from the wall. The door flew open and crashed violently against the interior wall, leaving a massive dent in the expensive wallpaper. The barricade was utterly destroyed in a fraction of a second. We stepped into the master bedroom. The scene inside was pathetic. Brian was standing near the expensive four-poster bed, clutching a heavy brass lamp as a makeshift weapon. His designer suit from the night before was completely ruined, wrinkled, and stained with sweat. Natalie was cowering near the walk-in closet, clutching a pile of expensive silk dresses to her chest, as if the soft fabric could somehow protect her from harsh reality. The police officers moved in with swift professional efficiency. They ordered Brian to drop the lamp. When he hesitated, freezing in pure terror, two officers grabbed his arms, twisted them firmly behind his back, and marched him toward the doorway. He did not fight back. The last ounce of fight had been completely drained from his body. He sobbed openly, his tears falling onto the ruined lapels of his suit. Natalie tried to resist. She screamed and thrashed as a female officer took her by the arm. She demanded time to pack her expensive jewelry and her designer shoes. Oliver stepped forward, holding the thick legal injunction. He informed her in a cold, clinical voice that she was legally forbidden from removing a single item from the property. The mansion and everything inside it had been seized to satisfy the massive $15 million debt they had assumed the day before. The clothes on their backs were the only things they were legally allowed to keep. They were marched out of the master bedroom and paraded down the grand staircase. I watched them descend the very steps they had previously used to look down on me. They were marched through the grand foyer past the shattered champagne flutes and the abandoned caviar. They were shoved out the front doors and escorted directly onto the cold concrete of the front curb. They had locked me in a damp, freezing basement, thinking they had won the ultimate prize. Now they were standing on the street, completely homeless. The humiliation was far from over. As they stood shivering on the sidewalk, the loud hydraulic whine of a flatbed tow truck pierced the morning air. Two heavy-duty repo trucks reversed slowly up the winding driveway. The drivers hopped out carrying heavy steel chains. They walked directly toward the garage where Brian kept his prized luxury vehicles. Brian watched in absolute horror as the men attached the thick steel hooks to the undercarriage of his leased European sports car. He loved that car more than he loved his own family. It was the ultimate symbol of his fabricated success. The hydraulic winch screamed loudly as it dragged the expensive vehicle up the steep metal ramp of the tow truck. The tires squealed against the pavement, a final pathetic cry of a dying empire. His luxury SUV received the exact same treatment seconds later. Brian fell to his knees on the damp grass near the curb. He buried his face in his hands, unable to watch his entire identity being hauled away down the suburban street. He had absolutely nothing left. His gas stations were seized. His logistics company was frozen. His house was gone. His cars were towed. He was a king without a kingdom, entirely crushed under the weight of his own profound arrogance. Natalie stood a few feet away, wrapping her arms around her ruined cashmere dress to ward off the morning chill. Her eyes darted wildly around the street, desperately searching for a way out, a lifeline, a loophole. She spotted a figure walking slowly down the sidewalk toward the main road. It was Leonard. Brian's father had spent the night sleeping in the guest house, trying to hide from the devastating revelations of the gala. He was carrying a small leather overnight bag, his face pale and haggard as he faced his own imminent federal investigations. He was trying to sneak away before the police asked him any difficult questions about his embezzled pension funds. Natalie saw him, and a sudden spark of desperate hope ignited in her eyes. She ran across the damp lawn toward the old banker. She grabbed his arm, her voice frantic and entirely devoid of pride. She begged Leonard to give her back the luxury Mediterranean cruise ticket she had presented to him as a gift just 2 weeks ago. She explained rapidly that it was a premium transferable package worth exactly $20,000. She pleaded with him, telling him she could take it to a travel agency downtown and pawn it for immediate survival cash. She needed that money to buy food and rent a cheap motel room. Leonard stopped walking. He looked down at the woman gripping his arm. The elegant retired banker who had always treated everyone with supreme arrogance looked completely hollowed out. He looked at Natalie and let out a loud laugh. It was not a cheerful sound. It was a dark, bitter scraping noise that clawed its way out of his dry throat. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out the glossy, printed cruise itinerary. He did not hand it back to her gently. He shoved the crumpled paper directly against her chest. He told her to take it. He told her she could try to pawn it anywhere she wanted, but it would not do her a single bit of good. Leonard leaned in close, his voice dripping with venomous defeat. He explained that the travel agency had called him the previous afternoon. The luxury booking had been completely canceled. The $20,000 payment had never cleared. Natalie stared at him in complete confusion. She told him that was impossible because she had paid for it using her premium platinum credit card. Leonard smiled a grim, terrifying smile. He informed her that her premium credit card had bounced hard. Oliver had not just frozen the corporate logistics accounts. Oliver's legal guillotine had moved with devastating speed, instantly freezing every single personal bank account and line of credit tied to their names the moment the reverse liability clause was officially activated. The $20,000 bribe she had tried to pay to save her husband was completely void. The paper in her hands was completely worthless. Natalie looked down at the glossy cruise brochure. Her hands began to shake violently, causing the stiff paper to rattle in the quiet morning air. The final escape route, the last hidden ace up her sleeve, simply vanished into thin air. She had traded her soul for a life of luxury, and now the devil had arrived to collect his absolute due. She had no money hidden away in secret accounts. She had no home to return to. She had no cars to drive, and absolutely no allies left to manipulate. She stood on the edge of the damp street, holding a worthless piece of paper, completely destitute and entirely alone. The sky above the city was a brilliant, clear blue, but the world inside room number 12 at the Starlight Motor Inn was a suffocating shade of gray. The motel sat on the absolute edge of the industrial district, where the air constantly smelled of burning diesel and rotting garbage. The heavy wooden door of the room was warped, and the security chain had been ripped out of the wall long ago. Inside, the carpet was stained with years of neglect and smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. There were no imported orchids or velvet armchairs here. There was only a sagging mattress covered in a thin, scratchy bedspread and a single flickering fluorescent bulb mounted on the stained ceiling. This was the new reality my daughter and her husband had purchased with their boundless greed. Brian sat on the edge of the mattress, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. He was still wearing the trousers from his expensive tailored suit, but the fabric was now wrinkled and smeared with dirt from the curb where the bailiffs had dumped him. His silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar and soaked in cold sweat. Natalie stood near the small, grimy window looking out at the parking lot through the broken plastic blinds. The silence between them was thick and toxic. They were entirely isolated. Their expensive smartphones had been shut off by the service providers that morning because the automatic payments were linked to their frozen bank accounts. They had no wealthy friends calling to offer them a guest house. The high society elite who drank their expensive champagne at the gala had abandoned them the exact second their fake empire collapsed. Hunger is a highly effective teacher. By the second afternoon, the reality of their absolute poverty began to set in. They had emptied their pockets onto the chipped wooden nightstand and found exactly $14.30 in loose cash. Natalie had stared at the crumpled bills and silver coins in absolute horror. 2 days ago, she was spending hundreds of dollars on a single bottle of imported wine. Now she was calculating how many packets of instant noodles she could buy at the local discount store. The massive $15 million debt hung over their heads like a suffocating, dark cloud. Every single cent they legally earned would be garnished and seized by my trust. They were trapped in a financial prison of their own making, with no lawyers and no escape routes. Brian realized very quickly that his illusion of being a brilliant corporate mind was completely worthless. He tried to walk into a downtown logistics firm to ask for a management position, but the security guards recognized his face from the morning news reports about the massive asset seizures. His name was entirely toxic in the corporate world. He had no genuine skills. He did not know how to build anything or fix anything. He had spent his entire adult life moving imaginary numbers around on digital spreadsheets and stealing from his own family. With his reputation destroyed and his accounts frozen, he was forced to seek the only kind of employment that paid cash daily and asked no questions. Early the next morning, Brian walked 2 miles to a commercial construction site on the south side of the city. The sun was already beating down mercilessly on the dusty ground. He approached the site foreman, a large, intimidating man with heavily calloused hands and a face weathered by years of hard labor. Brian swallowed his pride and asked for work. The foreman looked him up and down, taking in the ruined designer trousers and his incredibly soft, manicured hands. The foreman did not ask for a resume. He simply pointed to a massive pile of heavy concrete blocks and handed Brian a pair of cheap leather work gloves and a bright yellow hard hat. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. Brian spent the next 8 hours carrying heavy concrete blocks across the uneven dirt, carrying massive bags of cement on his shoulders, and digging trenches with a heavy steel shovel. The blistering heat of the sun burned his pale skin. The coarse leather gloves rubbed his soft hands raw until they were covered in open, bleeding blisters. Every muscle in his back screamed in agony with every single movement. He stumbled and dropped a heavy block, crushing his toe inside his thin leather shoes. Brian felt his muscles tearing and his lungs burning in the dusty air. He tried to take a break, but the foreman shouted across the site, demanding that he get back to the cement mixer. Brian had no choice but to obey because he desperately needed the $50 he would earn by the end of the shift. As Brian lifted another bag of heavy cement, he finally understood the profound irony of his situation. For years, he had looked down on me. He had mocked my faded flannel shirts and my heavy work boots. He had laughed at the dirt under my fingernails and called me a simple old man. He had never understood that the wealth he tried to steal was built on 40 years of exactly this kind of agonizing physical sacrifice. I had broken my body carrying bricks and pouring concrete so Natalie could grow up in a warm house with food on the table. Now Brian was feeling a tiny fraction of that agonizing physical pain, working for minimum wage just to afford a cheap motel room. The ground he used to walk on with such arrogance was now breaking his back. While Brian was destroying his body in the dirt, Natalie was facing her own crushing humiliation. She had always relied on the money of men to survive. First, she drained my pension and my grocery money, and then she relied on the fraudulent empire her husband built. Now both of those financial pillars were completely gone. She needed cash immediately to pay for another week at the motel before they were thrown out onto the street. She walked out of the motel and walked down the busy commercial road looking for any business with a hiring sign in the window. Fate has a very dark sense of humor. The only place willing to hire someone with no practical job experience and no recent references was the suburban gas station located just 2 blocks away from the motel. It was the exact same brightly lit convenience store where Brian had originally purchased the winning lottery ticket that started this entire cascade of destruction. The manager of the store, a young man barely out of college, handed Natalie her new uniform. It was a bright green polyester polo shirt and a cheap plastic name tag. It was a brutal contrast to the imported silk dresses and custom-tailored cashmere coats she used to wear to her exclusive country club luncheons. Natalie was forced to stand behind the sticky laminated counter for 9 grueling hours a day. Her feet throbbed in pain from standing on the hard linoleum floor. She had to learn how to operate the old cash register, ringing up cheap cigars, cheap beer, and bags of salty chips for the local workers. She had to smile politely at strangers who looked right through her. The smell of stale coffee and spilled gasoline clung to her hair and her clothes. When the store was empty, the manager handed her a dirty string mop and a bucket of gray soapy water. Natalie pushed the heavy string mop across the floor, feeling the dirty water splash against her cheap sneakers. She had never cleaned a floor in her life, having always relied on hired maids and cleaning services. Now she was the hired help, completely invisible to the customers who tracked fresh mud across the exact spot she had just washed. She stood near the lottery machine, watching people hand over their hard-earned money for a printed piece of cardboard. She scanned the barcodes and handed them their tickets, remembering the day Brian had brought home the winning numbers. She had thought that small piece of paper was her ticket to absolute royalty. She had believed she was destined to live in a mansion and look down on the rest of the world. Instead, that small piece of paper had systematically burned her entire life to the ground and dropped her right back at the exact starting line, completely devoid of her wealth and her dignity. The final crushing blow did not come from me or from Oliver. It came from the very society Natalie had tried so desperately to impress. It was late afternoon, and Natalie was wiping down the sticky counter near the hot dog roller. The bell above the glass door chimed loudly. She did not look up immediately, continuing to scrub a stubborn mustard stain with a cheap paper towel. Then she heard the heavy sound of a camera tripod hitting the linoleum floor. Natalie looked up and froze in absolute horror. A local news van had parked directly outside the large glass windows of the gas station. A very well-known local television reporter holding a microphone with a bright red station logo walked straight toward the counter. Behind the reporter, a cameraman had a massive high-definition broadcast camera hoisted onto his shoulder with a blinding white light pointed directly at Natalie's face. The news crew had been doing a follow-up story on the dramatic collapse of Brian's logistics company and the massive asset seizures that had shocked the local business community. Someone in the neighborhood had tipped them off about where the ruined socialite was now working. The bright camera light washed over Natalie, highlighting her cheap polyester uniform and her tired, pale face. The reporter shoved the microphone forward and began asking rapid-fire questions about the eviction and the massive fraud allegations surrounding her husband. The broadcast was completely live streaming her absolute humiliation to every single television screen in the city. The wealthy friends she used to impress at the country club were now watching her wipe down a dirty counter in a gas station wearing a plastic name tag and a look of total, absolute defeat. The morning air was crisp and completely still as I walked out of the local grocery store. The automatic glass doors slid shut behind me, shutting away the bright fluorescent lights and the soft hum of the refrigeration units. I carried 2 modest brown paper bags filled with simple provisions. There was fresh bread, sharp cheddar cheese, a dozen farm eggs, and a bag of dark roasted coffee beans. I did not need expensive caviar or imported truffles to feel satisfied. I found a profound, enduring peace in the simple routines of a quiet life. I walked across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot toward my vehicle. It was an old, reliable, heavy-duty pickup truck. The dark blue paint was faded by years of harsh sun and hard labor. The steel bumper carried a few dents from construction sites of the past. But the engine was perfectly tuned, and the transmission shifted with absolute precision. It was a machine built for utility and endurance. It was the exact opposite of the fragile leased luxury cars my son-in-law used to parade around the city. As I approached the truck, I noticed a solitary figure standing near the passenger side door. The person was leaning heavily against the cold steel of the truck bed. Their head was bowed forward, and their shoulders were slumped in a posture of total defeat. I slowed my pace. I tightened my grip on the brown paper bags. I did not feel fear. I only felt a cold, calculating awareness. I walked around the back of the truck and stepped into the clear morning light. The figure slowly lifted their head to look at me. It was my daughter. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. Natalie looked nothing like the arrogant high society woman who had commanded a grand ballroom just a few weeks ago. The expensive cashmere coats and custom-tailored silk dresses were completely gone. She was wearing the cheap, bright green polyester polo shirt from the suburban gas station. The fabric was stained with dark spots of grease and smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaning chemicals. Her pristine blonde hair was unwashed and pulled back into a messy knot, secured by a cheap plastic clip. The heavy designer makeup she used to wear like a mask was entirely absent. Her face was pale and drawn tight over her cheekbones. Dark purple shadows hung heavily beneath her bloodshot eyes. She looked like a woman who had not slept a full hour in weeks. But the most striking detail was her hands. I looked down at the hands that had once confidently signed the legal documents intended to steal my entire fortune. Her perfect, expensive manicures were a distant memory. Her fingernails were chipped and broken close to the quick. The skin on her fingers was raw and deeply chapped from pushing heavy string mops across dirty linoleum floors and scrubbing hot dog rollers with harsh degreasers. She rubbed her cracked hands together nervously as she stared at me. She was trembling. The cold morning wind cut right through her thin polyester uniform. She was completely broken. She did not approach me with the venomous anger she had displayed in the ballroom. She did not try to aggressively manipulate the situation. She took a small, hesitant step forward. She kept her head slightly lowered in a posture of complete and absolute submission. She looked at me with the terrified eyes of a stray animal cornered in an alleyway. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice failed her on the first attempt. She swallowed hard and tried again. Her voice was raspy and weak. She called me Dad. The word sounded foreign and strange coming from her lips after everything she had done. She began to speak in a rapid, desperate whisper. She told me she had walked 3 miles from the cheap motel to find me. She said she had waited in the parking lot for 2 hours, hoping I would come out to buy my morning coffee. She did not yell or demand anything. She simply began to beg. She told me that Brian had injured his back at the construction site and could not get out of bed. She explained that he had not been paid for the last 3 days of labor. She cried that her minimum wage shifts at the gas station barely covered the daily rate for the miserable motel room. She said they had completely run out of food the previous afternoon. Natalie took another step closer. She clasped her raw, chapped hands together in front of her chest. She pleaded for mercy. She abandoned every ounce of pride she had ever possessed. She told me she was not asking for $1 million. She swore she was not trying to fight the legal seizures or challenge the blind trust. She completely surrendered. She looked up at me with tears pooling in her bloodshot eyes. She asked me for a loan. She begged for just $1,000. She claimed that small amount would be enough to buy groceries and keep a roof over their heads for 2 more weeks while they figured out a plan. She promised with absolute desperation that she would pay me back every single penny. She swore she would work double shifts and scrub floors until her hands bled if I would just give her a tiny fraction of my wealth to keep them from starving in the street. I stood perfectly still and listened to her desperate, pathetic plea. I held the brown paper bags in my arms. I looked at her sunken cheeks and her trembling shoulders. A normal man might have felt a sudden surge of parental guilt. A normal man might have looked at his starving daughter and immediately reached for his checkbook to erase her suffering. But I am a master builder. I understand the fundamental laws of cause and effect. I understand that when a poorly constructed building collapses, you do not try to hold up the ruined walls with a single piece of cheap lumber. You let the rotten structure fall completely to the ground. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman standing in front of me. I felt no lingering parental weakness. I looked at her and saw the absolute truth of her character laid bare. She was not crying because she regretted locking her elderly father in a freezing basement. She was not begging because she felt remorse for stealing my meager pension to buy expensive handbags. She was only crying because her actions had finally generated severe personal consequences. She was begging because the cold, harsh reality of poverty was physically hurting her. The tears on her face were born entirely of selfish panic. I did not speak to her immediately. I walked past her in total silence. I reached the driver's side door of my heavy pickup truck. I placed the brown paper bags carefully on the passenger seat, ensuring the eggs and the fresh bread were secure. I closed the passenger door with a solid metallic thud. I turned around and walked back toward Natalie. She watched my every movement with a frantic, desperate hope. She truly believed her submissive tears had broken through my armor. She thought her pathetic display had successfully manipulated the old man one final time. I reached into the back pocket of my heavy denim jeans. I pulled out my old worn leather wallet. It was the same simple wallet I had carried for 20 years. Natalie let out a small, ragged breath. Her bloodshot eyes locked onto the leather. She leaned forward slightly. Her chapped hands twitched with anticipation. She was already imagining the $100 bills. She was already calculating how many days of survival she could purchase with my charity. I opened the leather fold. I did not look for my bank cards. I did not reach for the thick stack of large bills tucked in the back compartment. I used my calloused thumb and index finger to carefully extract a single crisp piece of paper currency. I pulled it out and held it up in the morning light. It was a $5 bill. Natalie stared at the small green bill in my hand. Her expression froze. The pathetic spark of hope in her eyes was instantly extinguished. She looked from the $5 bill up to my face in absolute, complete confusion. Her mind could not process what was happening. She stood there paralyzed by shock as I extended my arm and pressed the crisp paper bill directly into her raw, trembling palm. Her fingers automatically closed around the money, but she did not pull her hand away. I looked her directly in the eyes. My gaze was completely cold. My voice was utterly devoid of emotion. I spoke with the steady, unyielding finality of a judge delivering a permanent sentence. I reminded her of the last Father's Day we had shared together. I reminded her of the exact moment she had handed me a cheap piece of printed cardboard instead of a genuine expression of love. I gave her the very same advice she had given me on that day. "Try your luck," I told her. I did not wait for her to respond. I did not wait for the tears to return. I turned my back on her completely. I grabbed the heavy steel handle of my truck door and pulled it open. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, shutting out the cold wind and the pathetic sight of my ruined daughter. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it forward. The powerful engine roared to life instantly with a steady, reliable rumble. I shifted the transmission into gear and placed my hands on the worn steering wheel. I looked into the side rearview mirror as I began to drive away from the grocery store. I watched the scene unfold behind me. Natalie was still standing in the empty parking lot. She was staring down at the single $5 bill crushed in her hand. The absolute finality of her actions finally penetrated her arrogant mind. She realized there would be no rescue. There would be no forgiveness. The bridge she had burned was permanently destroyed. Her knees suddenly gave out. She collapsed completely onto the hard, cold pavement. She curled into a small, pathetic ball on the asphalt, completely shattered. She was finally alone in the wreckage she had built. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and drove my reliable truck down the quiet suburban road, leaving her far behind in the dust. The crisp morning air drifted through the open window of my small apartment, carrying the familiar, comforting scent of the city waking up. I sat alone at my worn wooden kitchen table holding a simple, thick ceramic mug of dark black coffee. The absolute chaos of the past few weeks had completely vanished, leaving behind a profound and heavy silence. Brian and Natalie were gone from my life forever. Leonard was facing his own total legal destruction in the federal courts. The massive suburban mansion was empty and locked tight, waiting to be liquidated. I had executed the perfect, meticulous demolition of a totally rotten structure, but now I was left standing in the empty lot, holding a massive sum of money. Oliver sat across from me in a simple wooden chair. He had traded his sharp charcoal suits for a modest gray sweater and dark practical trousers. He placed a thick, heavy folder of financial documents on the scratched surface of the table. He informed me in his calm, clinical voice that the syndicate's debt was permanently settled, the foreclosures were entirely finalized, and the anonymous blind trust currently held over $170 million in clean, liquid capital. He looked at me with deep, professional respect and asked me what I wanted to do with the massive empire I had just reclaimed. I looked down at the staggering rows of numbers printed on the crisp white paper. Most men my age who suddenly acquired that kind of astronomical wealth would immediately purchase a fleet of imported sports cars or a sprawling, secluded estate on a tropical island. They would buy expensive, heavy gold watches and surround themselves with the empty, shallow luxury that my daughter had craved so desperately. But I am a master builder. I know from decades of hard experience that shiny veneers and expensive fresh paint cannot hide a fundamentally weak foundation. I had absolutely no desire to live in a cavernous mansion. I did not want to eat tiny portions of expensive food surrounded by arrogant people who measured my worth by the designer brand of my leather shoes. I looked at the empty fabric chair next to the window where my late wife used to sit and knit quietly in the evenings. I remembered her warm, gentle smile and her strong, calloused hands. She had always believed deeply in the simple dignity of honest daily work. She had always tried to teach our daughter the fundamental value of earning a living through genuine effort. But those precious lessons had been completely corrupted by suburban greed. I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to use this massive, unexpected fortune to honor her memory properly. I needed to build something real that would last long after I was buried in the ground. I pushed the heavy bank statements back across the wooden table toward Oliver. I told the brilliant corporate lawyer that we were going to completely and permanently restructure the anonymous blind trust. We were not going to invest in fragile corporate logistics companies or volatile international stock markets. I instructed him to draft the complex legal framework for a massive new charitable organization. I told him we were going to call it the Foundation for the Forgotten. I explained my vision slowly and deliberately, ensuring he understood the exact specific architecture of my grand plan. We were going to buy large neglected plots of undeveloped land on the forgotten outskirts of the city. We were not going to build luxury residential condos or expensive retail shopping malls. We were going to build sprawling state-of-the-art trade schools. I wanted to create structured places where young men and women who had been completely left behind by the traditional academic education system could learn the absolute immense value of hard physical labor. I wanted to give them the practical, heavy tools to build their own lives from the ground up, just as I had done 40 long years ago. Oliver listened to my detailed instructions with a look of profound, genuine respect. He did not argue against the plan or suggest more profitable financial investments. He simply nodded his head, gathered his thick legal documents, and went to work with his usual terrifying absolute efficiency. Within 3 short weeks, the massive foundation was legally established and fully funded with clean capital. We purchased a massive, sprawling, abandoned industrial lot on the forgotten south side of the city. The uneven ground was covered in broken, jagged concrete and twisted, rusted metal, but I saw the absolute perfect canvas for a strong, enduring foundation. I did not hire an expensive, arrogant management firm to oversee the daily project from a comfortable, climate-controlled downtown office. I went to my small, dark closet and pulled out my heavy, worn leather work boots. I put on my faded, thick flannel shirt and my durable denim jeans. I drove my reliable, old, heavy-duty truck to the active construction site every single morning, long before the morning sun came up. I stood in the wet dirt and the thick mud, breathing in the beautiful, rich smell of wet earth and heavy diesel fuel. I was exactly where I belonged in the world. The rapid construction of the very first trade school became my absolute total focus in life. I hired the best local contractors and the most experienced, tough foremen in the entire state, but I was always there working right alongside them in the trenches. I helped pour the massive, heavy concrete foundations, ensuring the gray mixture was perfect and the essential leveling was completely flawless. I carried heavy, rough wooden beams on my shoulders, and drove thick steel nails deep into the solid framing. The blistering afternoon sun beat down heavily on my back, and my aging muscles ached with a familiar, deeply comforting physical pain. The young, strong workers on the busy site did not know I was the actual billionaire funding the entire massive project. They just thought I was a tough, experienced old foreman who demanded absolute total perfection in every single tiny measurement. I showed them how to properly and safely swing a heavy steel hammer and how to accurately read a complex blue architectural print. I taught them that a single poorly cut piece of cheap wood compromises the entire massive structure. The daily exhausting physical labor slowly healed the deep open wounds in my soul. Every single heavy brick I laid, and every solid wooden wall I raised, felt like a beautiful silent tribute to the good woman I had loved and lost. Months passed rapidly, and the cold seasons changed. The ugly, abandoned industrial lot was completely and miraculously transformed into a sprawling, beautiful, modern educational campus. The new trade school featured massive open-air practical workshops filled entirely with state-of-the-art, heavy woodworking machinery, bright welding stations, and extensive automotive repair bays. It was a modern cathedral dedicated entirely and exclusively to the profound dignity of honest, hard labor. The crisp day of the official grand opening finally arrived. There were no wealthy, arrogant socialites invited to the event. There was no loud, live jazz orchestra or expensive flowing champagne. The only guests were the humble local community members, the tired construction workers who had physically built the campus, and the very first diverse class of young hopeful students eager to learn a real trade. I stood quietly near the main entrance, holding a simple pair of sharp steel scissors. Oliver stood silently by my side, watching the happy crowd with a rare and genuine warm smile. The strong autumn wind was crisp and cool, carrying the wonderful, familiar scent of freshly cut natural pine from the main busy workshop. I cut the simple, thin red ribbon, and the heavy, solid wooden doors of the school swung open widely to welcome the future. I walked slowly and quietly through the massive, busy woodworking shop, breathing in the rich, thick smell of fine sawdust and heavy machine oil. The large, bright room was filled entirely with young men and women wearing heavy, durable canvas aprons and clear, protective safety glasses. They were focused entirely and absolutely on their physical work, completely ignoring the flashing cameras and the curious local reporters. I stopped walking near a large, heavy industrial table saw and quietly watched a young man working. He was perhaps 19 years old, with dark grease smeared on his pale cheek and thick dirt firmly packed under his short fingernails. He was measuring a thick, heavy piece of solid raw oak with absolute and intense total concentration. He marked the rough wood with a thick, dark graphite pencil, checked his exact angles twice, and made a perfectly smooth, completely precise, clean cut. He brushed the fine light sawdust away from the fresh, sharp edge and smiled with a quiet, profound, and deep satisfaction. He had created something tangible and completely real with his own two calloused hands. I looked at the young, focused carpenter and saw a perfect, clear reflection of my own distant youth. I saw the exact same desperate hunger to build, the same profound respect for the raw materials, and the same quiet, deep pride in a hard job well done. I realized in that profound, silent moment exactly what true, immense wealth really meant. True wealth was not a massive, staggering pile of digital numbers hidden away in an anonymous, secret, blind trust. True wealth was not a sprawling, empty suburban mansion filled completely with imported, useless luxury goods or a noisy fleet of expensive, fragile sports cars. Those superficial things were just fragile, temporary illusions that could be totally destroyed in a single dark night by a simple, hidden legal clause. True wealth was the rare, incredible ability to take raw, untested potential and shape it carefully into something strong and permanently enduring. I had used my massive, unexpected fortune to build a solid foundation that would teach generations of young lost people how to stand firmly on their own two calloused feet. I had given them the heavy practical tools to build their own lives with absolute dignity and quiet honor. I watched the young, proud carpenter run his calloused, dirty hand over the smooth, fresh oak wood, and I felt a deep, absolute, and permanent peace finally settle into my old, tired bones. The rotten, toxic structure of the past was completely and forever demolished, and the new, beautiful foundation was finally perfectly set. I had spent the entire morning shaking hands and cutting the ceremonial ribbon, but now I needed a moment of absolute quiet. I walked away from the main courtyard, leaving the cheerful voices and the loud hum of the heavy machinery behind me. I found a simple wooden bench situated on a small grassy hill overlooking the entire sprawling campus. I sat down heavily, feeling the familiar comforting ache in my aging muscles. The autumn air was wonderfully crisp and completely clear, carrying the rich scent of freshly cut pine and damp earth. I looked down at the massive complex I had built with my own hands and my anonymous wealth. It was a beautiful monument to hard work and honest labor. As I sat there, the chaotic memories of the past few months began to wash over me, but they no longer carried any emotional weight. The loud, violent shouting in the grand ballroom, the desperate, pathetic pleas in the grocery store parking lot, and the toxic, suffocating noise of my former family had completely faded away. They were just distant echoes of a poorly constructed building that had finally collapsed into dust. I breathed in the cold, fresh air and felt the profound silence of a completely clean slate. The crunch of heavy boots on the gravel path interrupted my quiet meditation. I did not need to turn my head to know who was approaching. Oliver walked up the small hill, moving with the calm, deliberate pace of a man whose complex work was entirely finished. He was not wearing his intimidating charcoal suits today. He wore a heavy, thick wool sweater and practical dark trousers, looking more like a quiet academic than the most terrifying corporate lawyer in the city. He held two thick ceramic mugs in his hands. Steam rose gently from the dark liquid into the cool morning air. Oliver sat down on the wooden bench right next to me in comfortable silence. He handed me one of the heavy mugs. It was thick black coffee, exactly the way I always drank it. I took the mug, feeling the wonderful intense heat transfer through the ceramic into my cold, calloused palms. We sat there together without speaking a single word, simply watching the young students walk through the front doors of the massive trade school. They carried heavy toolboxes and wore durable canvas work clothes. They walked with purpose and quiet dignity. Oliver took a slow sip of his coffee and looked at the massive brick workshops. He told me that in all his years of moving imaginary numbers across international borders, he had never felt the deep, profound satisfaction of actually building something real. He said that the corporate world was just a fragile illusion made of paper and empty promises, but this campus was something that would outlast both of us. I nodded in silent agreement. We had spent weeks legally destroying the toxic empire that Brian had built on lies and stolen money. We had watched Leonard get dragged away by federal investigators to answer for his massive pension embezzlement. We had seen the absolute total ruin of greedy people who believed they were untouchable. But destruction was never my ultimate goal. I am a master builder at my very core. I only tear down rotten structures so I can clear the land and build something incredibly strong in their place. This school was the ultimate justification for the terrible war we had just fought. The harsh winter wind picked up slightly, rustling the golden and orange leaves on the tall oak trees surrounding the quiet campus. The sky above us was a brilliant, endless blue without a single dark cloud in sight. I looked down at my hands resting firmly around the warm ceramic coffee mug. They were old hands, heavily scarred and deeply calloused by 40 years of relentless physical labor. Dirt was permanently embedded in the deep lines of my palms. My knuckles were swollen and stiff from decades of swinging heavy steel hammers and mixing wet gray concrete. I studied these hands with a profound new respect. These were the very hands that had built a modest life from absolute scratch. These were the hands that had held my late wife as she took her final breath. These were the hands that had tried to raise a family, only to watch that family rot away from the inside out. But most importantly, these were the hands that had systematically dismantled a nightmare and meticulously rebuilt a massive, enduring empire in its place. I had lost a selfish, greedy family, but I had gained an entire campus of young, eager builders who would carry on the true legacy of honest work. The wealth that the lottery had dumped into my lap was no longer a curse or a heavy burden. It had become the absolute solid bedrock for thousands of future lives. Every single brick laid in the workshops below us, and every solid piece of steel welded by those students, was a testament to the undeniable value of physical labor. My late wife would have looked at this campus with immense, overwhelming pride. She would have loved the smell of the sawdust and the loud ringing of the metal hammers. She would have known that this was the exact right thing to do with the money. Oliver finished his coffee and stood up from the wooden bench. He adjusted his heavy wool sweater and looked down at me with a rare, genuine smile. He told me he was heading back to his downtown office to finalize the remaining trust documents and ensure the school was legally protected for the next century. He said it was an absolute honor to be the architect of this incredible transition. I reached out and shook his smooth, clean hand with my rough, calloused one. We had started as unlikely allies in a dark, freezing basement, and we had ended up as true brothers in arms, standing on the top of a beautifully restored world. I watched him walk back down the gravel path toward his waiting vehicle, leaving me completely alone on the quiet, grassy hill. The world around me was no longer a chaotic mess of lies, hidden debts, and terrifying midnight invasions. The absolute order of the universe was perfectly, completely restored. The greedy people who tried to steal my life were banished to the harsh, brutal reality of the world they had created for themselves. The massive fortune was permanently secured in an unbreakable fortress of education and hard work. I took one final long sip of the hot black coffee, letting the warmth spread deep into my chest. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the cold wooden slats of the bench. I listened to the beautiful distant hum of the heavy wood saws cutting through solid oak. The foundation beneath my feet was absolutely unshakable, and for the very first time in my long, difficult life, I was finally completely at peace.